K2 doesn't kill climbers the way Everest does. It waits. Every year, people arrive at this mountain rich, elite, confident, and certain they understand the risk. Some of them lie. Some of them cheat. Some of them leave their friends behind. Some of them never come back. And some come back changed forever. In the next few hours, you're going to see what really happens on the world's most unforgiving mountain. The lies caught on camera, the deaths no one wanted to talk about, the scandals that split the climbing world, and the moment in 2025 when K2 crossed a line it can never uncross. These aren't just climbing stories, they're stories about ego, survival, betrayal, and the exact second a human realizes the mountain has already decided their fate. Once you start this journey up K2, there's no easy way down. Stay with us, because the truth only gets darker the higher you climb. Welcome to the Extreme Edge K2 Marathon. July 29, 1939. High on the slopes of K2, the mountain climbers call the Savage One. A lone man sat frozen in his tent. No food, no fire, and the wind outside screamed like it was trying to tear the mountain apart. The man was Dudley Wolf, a millionaire turned adventurer who had never climbed higher than the Alps. His leader, Fritz Weissner, had retreated down the mountain, leaving Dudley behind in the thin air to die. When word of what happened reached the world below, it sparked one of the most bitter controversies in climbing history. Did Fritz abandon a man who paid for the expedition? Or was Dudley's arrogance and his money the real reason 4 people never came home? Some called it a tragic accident, others called it a cold betrayal. But the truth of what happened on K2 that summer, who climbed, who quit, and who was left to die, reveals something far darker than a simple mountaineering failure. From controversy, sacrifice, to unanswered questions, this is the story of the millionaire who was left to die on K2. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. Dudley Wolf was a wealthy American socialite born in New York City on February 6, 1896. His father was a coffee importer who earned a reputation for telling made-up stories about his aristocratic background and his travels across India hunting tigers. His mother, on the other hand, was the daughter of a wealthy businessman, Benjamin Franklin Smith. Alongside his 3 brothers, they amassed a fortune of around $30 million by the 1880s, which is worth close to $1 billion today. This allowed Dudley to have a lavish upbringing. He attended prestigious boarding schools, and despite his efforts in his studies, his academic progress was poor. But he loved sports, and during his time at school, he played football, hockey, and even excelled in boating and hunting, showing the first signs of his adventurous spirit. By 1916, he had left school and struggled to find a job. He wasn't interested in the family business that had since evolved into a real estate and railroad empire. Instead, young Dudley wanted to help people, and with the ongoing war in Europe, he couldn't think of a better cause. After being rejected from the U.S. military due to poor eyesight and flat feet, he didn't give up. Instead, Dudley volunteered for the Red Cross Ambulance Corps in Europe, something you wouldn't expect from an inherently wealthy young man. He even went on to earn the Italian Croce di Guerra and a campaign medal. He later joined the French Foreign Legion in October 1918, serving for a month until the fighting ended on the Western Front. After the war, Dudley returned to Omaha in the United States, and with nothing else to turn to, he found himself helping run the family's real estate business. But his heart wasn't in it. He wanted more from life. He loved the outdoors and spent a considerable amount of time fantasizing about jobs that would allow him to work outside. Then, out of nowhere, an opportunity fell into his lap, and in 1924, Dudley's life would change forever. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, see exclusive videos made just for you, get early access to our other content, and vote on content polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. In 1924, Dudley and his brothers were summoned to their 94-year-old grandfather's enormous Maine estate. At this point, he was widely considered the richest man in New England. None of his grandfather's brothers had any children of their own, so the vast family fortune was passed on to Dudley and his brothers. By this time, it's believed the brothers were worth an estimated $100 million, or around a staggering $1.4 billion today. Dudley was set to become one of the richest men in America. No longer did he have to work. He could spend his time doing what he loved. But in a strange turn of events, he decided to apply for Harvard University. Even without any academic qualifications, Dudley was surprisingly accepted in 1925. It was during his time at Harvard that he began to explore what would become one of his true passions, yacht racing. This is where his love for the extreme became apparent. In the years that followed, he spent countless hours racing across the open water on the Atlantic and even won the Brooklyn Yacht Club's Deep Sea Challenge Cup. He commissioned a 60-foot schooner named Mohawk in 1929 and became the first person to race a 60-foot yacht across the Atlantic, competing in the King and Queen's Cup Classic and finishing second against much larger vessels. After graduating from Harvard, Dudley once again found himself at a crossroads. His love for yacht racing wasn't what it once was, and he became tired of the social circles he found himself in. This led Dudley to move to Europe, where he took up mountaineering and skiing. Dudley was a natural when it came to skiing. He practiced almost daily and used it as a release from the pressures of daily life. In time, he became known for his skills in gliding down the Alps and even managed to ski across the Mont Blanc Massif. At the same time, he began climbing, but he did find the technical aspects of the sport challenging. Despite his wealth and adventurous spirit, he was described as gentle, cheerful, and rather shy. But this didn't stop him from finding true love. In 1934, he married Alice Blaine Damrosch, an accomplished skier and outdoor enthusiast. It's almost as if they were made for each other. By now, you might be wondering, how did a rich, yacht-owning, inexperienced mountaineer find himself lost in the death zone of the most dangerous mountain on Earth? Well, this part of our story began in early 1938, 4 years into marriage. One evening, Dudley and his wife invited many people to their bougie Fifth Avenue apartment in Manhattan to show off slides of their time skiing and climbing throughout Europe. It just so happens that German-American mountaineer Fritz Weissner was invited. Just a year earlier, Fritz had given a speech at the American Alpine Club, where he revealed his daring plan to organize an expedition to climb K2 for the first time. Fritz knew it would be difficult to acquire funding for the expedition, as the American economy wasn't great in 1938. So he would have to find climbers who could pay their own way. At this time, all in, it would cost around $17,500 per person, which is equivalent to a whopping $309,000 today. When Fritz spoke with Dudley in his apartment, he quickly realized he was in luck. Dudley was immediately hooked on the idea of climbing the world's second tallest mountain, despite having zero experience in high-altitude regions. But inexperience had never stopped him from achieving any of his other goals in life. After all, if he could get into Harvard without any qualifications and race a yacht across the Atlantic, a climb up a mountain should be easy, right? Well, as longtime viewers of the channel know, climbing one of the world's tallest mountains is no walk in the park. Climbing any Himalayan peak, whether one of the tallest or not, is way different from the Alps. At this point in history, none of the world's 8,000-meter peaks had ever been summited, and K2 itself stood as one of the greatest challenges humans could face. Towering at over 28,251 feet above sea level, it is only surpassed by Mount Everest in size. But despite being slightly shorter, today it's considered far more dangerous. K2 has a reputation for its extreme steepness, its thousands of meters of technical rock and ice climbing, and the potential for blizzards, rock falls, and avalanches at any minute. For Dudley, he had experienced little of this side of extreme mountaineering, and if he wanted to survive the expedition, he needed to train harder than ever. As for Fritz, there was no changing his mind. He needed Dudley's financial contributions. This was a crucial part of achieving his goal of taking the first Americans to the summit of an 8,000-meter peak. At the time, Fritz likely knew his decision to include Dudley could endanger both the team and the millionaire. But, on the other hand, life's greatest rewards often come with considerable risk. Dudley might not have been the smartest kid in school, but he wasn't stupid. In preparation for the climb, he tried to summit Mount Blanc and Peace Palu in the spring of 1939, but he failed miserably in both climbs, even with the help of a guide. Things were not looking good, but Dudley remained motivated, believing that these were only minor setbacks and that his strength and willpower alone would take him where no climber had ever been, to the summit of K2. By March, Dudley met Fritz in England, where they began buying all the equipment needed for the expedition. Dudley had plenty of money, and no expense was spared. They bought the best gear available at the time, including heavy tents, inflatable mattresses, stoves, nailed boots, and sleeping bags. For food, they brought plenty of dehydrated items, milk, fruits, and vegetables, but most of the energy they'd consume on the climb was from canned goods and dried meats. Fritz and Dudley were joined by 4 other climbers on the team, including Jack Durrance, Chappelle Cranmer, George Sheldon, and Tony Cromwell, who served as the deputy leader. Tony was another wealthy man who didn't need to work a regular job. Unlike Dudley, Tony spent his time climbing mountains around the world and was the perfect sidekick for Fritz. The team hired 9 Sherpas and many more porters, and together they would attempt to complete the impossible and scale K2. On March 29, 1939, Dudley met up with the rest of the team in Genoa and boarded the SS Conte Biancamano, which would take them to Bombay, India. This was the beginning of their 6-month expedition and the first step in making history. From here, the team took a lengthy 40-hour train journey to Rawalpindi before 2 cars took them onward to Srinagar in the Vale of Kashmir. By the end of April, the climbers met up with the Sherpas and porters. But during this part of the 20th century, there was no road to the mountain. Instead, Dudley and the team had to trek over 330 miles to reach the foot of K2. As they traveled on foot and by horse, it must have seemed like a different world to the Western men. This is apparent in an account by Tony, who wrote, "This is indeed a bleak and barren country, and how the inhabitants manage to live fills me with a constant admiration and wonder. The hills are entirely barren of vegetation, which only exists on the irrigated alluvial fans." After a month on the road, hiking day after day, Dudley finally caught the first glimpse of K2 at the end of May. In good spirits, he and the rest of the team had established base camp at 16,500 feet a short time later. Next came the hard part that they came for, climbing the mountain. Almost immediately, the team was hit with a major blow as Chappell Cranmer fell extremely sick. He was treated by Jack despite having little to no medical training, even giving him artificial respiration for over 2 hours, which likely saved his life. Thus, before they even made it beyond base camp, they were a man down, and the clock was ticking. If they wanted to reach the summit in the climbing window, they had to push worries aside and start making progress. Over the next month, Dudley and the others did their best to acclimate to the mountain. They hauled over 700 pounds of goods upwards to Camp 1. From here, they continued to move goods to Camp 2, which served as the main low-level location for supplies. At its greatest extent, over 1.5 tons of supplies were stored there. Everything seemed to be going well for Dudley. He had held his own during the initial stages of the expedition, but once they started climbing upwards, things changed. His inexperience began to show, and some of the other climbers began arguing that his clumsiness had put them in danger. But he was well liked and showed he was a hard worker. This kept him in the good books of Fritz, who likely had a soft spot for Dudley because of his financial contributions to the expedition. By June 21st, the team faced another major setback as a severe blizzard hit the mountain. Temperatures plummeted to -2 degrees Fahrenheit, and the team was confined to Camp 4 for over a week. The mental toll this took on the rest of the climbers was astonishing. I mean, can you imagine being stuck on top of a cold, barren mountain with little to do to pass the time as strong winds batter into your tent? Many likely wondered if it was a sign to return home after the storm abruptly ended on June 29th. But unlike the rest of the team, Dudley and Frisk remained as motivated as ever and helped encourage the team to keep going. Remarkably, the team continued to make great progress. By the end of the month, Fritz scaled the infamous house chimney, a 100-foot-tall crack in a rock wall. This is an extremely dangerous and technical part of the climb, but luckily for Dudley, Fritz had set up tight ropes from which he could pull the inexperienced climber up. The pair was joined by 2 Sherpas, and together they established Camp 5. But despite the initial joy of the team, the grueling climb had begun to take its toll on Dudley. When Jack arrived at Camp 5, he inspected Dudley's feet, and to his shock, he discovered signs of frostbite. This was a serious problem. If left untreated, the skin and tissue would begin to die, and the affected body part would have to be removed. But Dudley seemed unfazed. Instead, he mustered up some courage and pushed on to Camp 6, albeit at a slow pace. Jack initially suggested Dudley should retreat back down the mountain. However, he was overruled by Fritz, who allowed him to continue. Some consider this a reckless decision, but what do you think? Should Dudley have turned back at this point, considering his condition? Nonetheless, Dudley pushed on beside the team. Every day was now a battle against the elements and their own minds. His climbing skills were not the best, but what he lacked in this department he made up for with his drive and strength. By July 14th, after several brutal months on the mountain, they had finally established Camp 8. But by now, Dudley's body began to turn on him. Early in the 20th century, bottled oxygen had not yet become as popular as it is today in the mountaineering world. Climbers like Dudley had to ensure they properly acclimated to the mountain, but even then, spending so much time tens of thousands of feet above sea level is both incredibly dangerous and tough on the body. By this point, both Dudley and Fritz had spent an astonishing 3 weeks above 22,000 feet. From here, the team was now close enough to make a push for the summit, but down below, things were falling apart. Jack was forced to retreat down to Camp 2 as he began to suffer from hypoxia due to a lack of oxygen. When he arrived, he found the camp in a mess, and Tony had lost all motivation to continue with the expedition. This was a serious problem, as now there was no link between those high on the mountain and their vital supply line below. But high on the mountain, where Dudley, Fritz, and several of the Sherpas were preparing to climb the last 3,000 feet, little did they know they had greatly outpaced their supply lines. This would come back to haunt them later. On July 17th, Dudley, Fritz, and Pasang Lama began their final push on K2. This was it. Could they make history by becoming the first climbers to reach the summit of one of the world's 8,000-meter peaks? This was everything they had worked for, and now it was within their grasp. But as they pushed on from Camp 8, Dudley had reached his limit. His body could take no more, and he returned to camp. For over a week, Dudley remained in Camp 8 alone as Fritz and Pasang pushed for the summit. I find it difficult to imagine just how isolated Dudley must have felt. By then, he was likely delusional and in serious pain from the frostbite that was slowly eating away at his feet. The only sound was the biting wind that whipped against his tent. Below, a dizzying expanse of jagged peaks stretched to the horizon and served as a terrifying reminder of his isolation. He was all alone on the savage mountain with nowhere to go. All he could do was hope either the Sherpas or one of the climbers would return. Higher up the mountain, Fritz and Pasang made their final summit push on July 19th, and despite getting within 800 feet of the true summit, they decided to retreat as Pasang refused to continue out of fear. Speaking on the decision, Fritz later wrote, "I regretted many times on the way down that I had given in. It would have been so much easier for us to go on to the summit and return over the difficult part of the route the next morning." Even with the retreat, the dream wasn't over for Fritz. He believed they could just return to Camp 8, collect supplies, and push for the summit once more. But when he arrived, he was horrified to find Dudley had been alone the entire time. Fritz couldn't understand why the crew below hadn't brought up further supplies, nor why no one had come to check on them. By this point, Dudley had completely run out of matches, meaning he couldn't cook or even melt snow for water. Dudley and Fritz were unaware at this point that the rest of the team below was under the impression that everyone high on the mountain had perished. Several days earlier, one of the Sherpas had got to within 500 feet of Camp 8 and called out 3 times, but Dudley didn't hear his call. After seeing signs of a recent avalanche, he presumed the climbers had died during their push up the mountain. Dudley was now in a bad way, but managed to get to his feet, and together, all three men descended to Camp 7. But on their way down, disaster struck. Dudley's clumsiness led him to fall, almost sending all three men down the Godwin-Austen Glacier. Luckily, they managed to survive and made it to Camp 7 safely, but when they arrived, they were horrified to find few supplies and their tents buried under snow. Now it was a fight for survival. The climbers knew they had to trek to lower camps for supplies. Fritz claimed Dudley offered to remain behind at Camp 7 while he and Pasang descended. But after spending such a long time at altitude, it's possible neither of the men were thinking straight. Dudley was clearly suffering from both the freezing temperatures and the altitude. As Fritz and Pasang went down the mountain, camp after camp they found abandoned with little food, and by the time they reached base camp, they were exhausted and could barely walk. Fritz was enraged with the rest of the climbers, claiming they had left them to die on the mountain, and even threatened to sue them. Tony fired back at Fritz, claiming he had abandoned Dudley high on the mountain, and to some extent, he wasn't wrong. From this point onwards, Fritz and Tony became mortal enemies. But despite their differences, there was a greater and more important problem: Dudley. Once again, he was alone on K2, and this time, the climbers would have to travel back up the dangerous mountain to rescue him. On July 25th, Jack and 3 Sherpas started to make their way up the mountain, but they only made it as far as Camp 4. From here, only 2 Sherpas had the strength to continue and push onwards to Camp 6. A few days later, Pasang Kikuli and Tsering Norbu left base camp as reinforcements and managed to climb an astonishing 7,000 feet in one day to reach Camp 6 by nightfall. This kind of climb was comparable to the much later alpine style that would soon shape the mountaineering world. On July 29th, Pasang Kikuli, Pasang Kitar, and Finsu set off from Camp 6, whereas Tsering Norbu remained behind. They finally made it to Dudley. They expected to be met with excitement as they came to bring him down the mountain and back to his life of luxury. But this was not the case. By now, he was clearly suffering from altitude sickness. When they approached his tent, they found him huddled up inside, and the floor was covered in his own urine and feces. He had no water or warm food, and he wasn't thinking clearly as he refused to leave. Instead, he asked the Sherpas to come back the following day, and he would be ready for the descent. It likely was the altitude sickness talking, not him. As wild as this story is, I'm not sure I was prepared to learn about the events that would unfold next. The Sherpas actually did leave him, and they couldn't return until July 31st due to a storm, 2 days after they found him in that horrifying condition. But when they did set off, it was the last time any of them were seen alive. It's uncertain what happened to the Sherpas as they bravely traveled back up to the next camp in hopes of saving Dudley's life, but after 2 days, Tsering realized they were not coming back, and he quickly made his way back down to base camp. Jack and the others were shocked to see Tsering return alone. Writing in his diary, Jack shared his thoughts on the news that no one returned from Camp 7. He said, "The Sherpas are certain something awful has happened. Weissner thought differently. No, it seems impossible that anything should have happened to such an able group." Fritz's thoughts at the time might seem absurd, but remember, even he didn't know just how deadly this mountain would become to future climbers. Fritz decided to organize a third rescue attempt, possibly because he felt guilty for leaving Dudley alone at Camp 7. Guilt can be a strange emotion for an individual. Imagine a weight, not a physical burden, but something far heavier pressing down on your soul. It's the ghost of a past mistake, a moment you wish you could erase. This is guilt. And for some, this crushing burden doesn't lead to quiet reflection, but to a dangerous, desperate dance with recklessness. Maybe now Fritz had to believe he could rescue Dudley. If not, he'd have to accept his role in his death. Fritz was the only climber strong enough to attempt another trip up the mountain, so on August 3rd, he set off with Tsering and Dawa Thondup Sherpa. But progress was painstakingly slow, and they only made it to Camp 1 after climbing all day. Then, another storm hit the mountain, causing the men to become stranded once more. It was at this point that it appears Fritz had lost all hope, and finally came to the conclusion that Dudley, and the 3 Sherpas had all lost their lives. There was nothing more they could do, and so Fritz decided they would return to base camp. When they arrived, they were in a pitiful state. The men packed up what they could and began the long trek back to Srinagar, where Fritz would have to face the first of many controversies centered on the idea that he was responsible for not only Dudley's death, but, by association, the deaths of the 3 Sherpas. This idea was pushed heavily by Tony, who had continued to argue that Fritz had murdered Dudley. During his time in Srinagar, Tony had even spoken with the British community, claiming Fritz's leadership skills were appalling. In the years that followed, Fritz would have to explain what happened on the mountain time and time again, with some reports implying he was responsible for the deaths. After all, he was the only experienced climber. Critics argued he was too focused on the summit, and that his leadership contributed to the tragedy. The initial accounts of the climb placed much of the blame on him. Some even claim Fritz's desire for glory overshadowed the safety of his team. When he returned to the U.S., Fritz sat down for an interview with the New York Times, in which he compared the K2 expedition to that of war, where we must expect casualties. This didn't sit well with many in the mountaineering community who believe he was making excuses for abandoning Dudley. However, others did take Fritz's side. Looking back, it's a really tough situation. On one hand, you have the leader's responsibility. On the other hand, you have the brutal realities of high-altitude climbing. Was it a calculated risk that went wrong, or was it a lapse in judgment? There's no definitive answer that everyone agrees on. The debate continued for decades. Some saw Fritz Weissner as a hero who pushed the limits, while others saw him as a reckless leader who sacrificed a team member. The tragedy of Dudley Wolf's death remains a somber chapter in the history of K2 climbing, and the question of Fritz's responsibility is still discussed today. One thing we know today is that it's surprising anyone made it back from the expedition. As the decades passed and humans climbed to the peak of the world's tallest mountains like Everest, Kanchenjunga, and Lhotse, K2 itself stood out for its particularly dangerous nature. Today, Karakoram 2 is regarded by most mountaineers as the most dangerous mountain on planet Earth. The bodies of Dudley and the 3 Sherpas who went to save his life were never found, and they became 4 in a long list of deaths that would earn K2 the name Killer Mountain. August 2nd, 2008. 2 men stood high on K2. The mountain climbers call it the Savage One. One of them would be dead within hours. The other would tell the world what happened. 2 friends stood where few humans ever have. By nightfall, one would be gone. The other would tell a story the world would believe for years. A story that wasn't true. Because up here, truth dies slower than people do. But years later, new evidence suggested something far darker. That the truth of what happened on K2 that day might be nothing like the story Marco told. Did a hero die saving lives? Or did a survivor lie about what really happened up there? This is the story of the K2 climber who lied about his friend's death, and the secret that has haunted the mountain ever since. Marco Confortola liked to say he was born in the mountains, that the thin air of Valfurva, Italy, was the first thing he ever breathed. And honestly, the story fit him perfectly. The image of a boy raised among glaciers, destined for the heights, was a story the newspapers loved. He grew up watching his father tie knots and read snow the way others read books. Guiding was in the family blood, and by the time Marco was a teenager, he was determined to follow in his father's footsteps. He would later boast that he became a certified mountain guide at 18, one of the youngest ever to earn the coveted UIAGM IFMGA badge. Earning that badge was no simple task. Candidates were thrown into the Alps for days of draining tests. They practiced crevasse rescues in blizzards, navigation drills in whiteouts, and knowingly stayed in temporary camps called bivouacs on exposed ridges. Most came back with frostbitten fingers and haunted eyes. Others failed terribly. And when Marco made it out, he passed by a margin so thin that even his instructors were surprised. That narrow victory became the foundation of a legend. By his 20s, he had joined the Alpine Rescue Service of Lombardy. These are the men who go up when everyone else is coming down, the ones who climb toward disaster. It was a very difficult job, the kind where you arrive at the avalanche too late, where victory means carrying a body back intact. Marco claimed to have climbed Grand Zebru nearly 300 times, enough to know every crack by name. The figure sounded impossible, but in that valley, no one argued out loud. Whispers said he counted helicopter rescues among those ascents, but Marco couldn't care less. He continued to build his identity there, on repetition and risk. Soon enough, the Alps had become too familiar and perhaps too small for Marco. The great drama of high-altitude life was happening elsewhere, in the Himalayas, and he knew he had to share in the thrills. So, in the early 2000s, Marco began to go on high-altitude expeditions in the Himalayas, but none of them made the news like his announcement to climb Everest in 2004. Marco Confortola's ascent of Everest began on the Tibetan Plateau, already at a lung-crushing altitude of over 17,000 feet. The first major hurdle was the North Col, a wall of ice rising to about 23,300 feet. Here, Marco and his team would hammer their crampons into the blue ice, ascending fixed ropes up this 1,000-foot headwall, all while exposed to the constant threat of ice collapses from above. Once above the col, the real test began on the northeast ridge. As he continued his ascent past Camp 1, Marco would have spent hours navigating this rocky spine, moving from Camp 2 at around 24,750 feet toward the infamous 3 steps, between 27,500 and 28,000 feet. On the second step, there's a vertical rock cliff nearly 100 feet high at around 28,140 feet. This is where the famous Chinese ladder is fixed. Imagine dragging your exhausted body, starved of oxygen, up a near vertical ladder at an altitude where jets fly. The physical and mental effort required is almost unimaginable. After clearing the third step, the final challenge was the summit ridge itself. This is a long, deceptive traverse that seems to go on forever above 28,500 feet. Each step in the thin air requires a massive effort of will. When Marco finally stood on the summit at 29,032 feet, he had achieved a remarkable feat. The greatest danger on the north side is the extended time spent in the death zone. Descending the second step using a doubled rope wrapped around the body and fixed at a higher point is technically even more demanding than ascending it. Fatigue, dehydration, and hypoxia set in, turning simple tasks into life or death struggles. By the time he returned to Italy, newspapers ran his story with pride, but Marco wasn't done. He announced that he had done it without supplemental oxygen, and the claim sparked doubt among members of the climbing community. There were no independent witnesses near the top, and no photographs showing his summit. Some who had shared base camp said he looked far too fresh afterwards for a man who had gone oxygenless. Marco never responded, but 2 years later, in 2006, he made his way to Annapurna, where he joined Silvio Mondinelli. This was a step in his pursuit of all 14 26,000-foot summits. When Marco retells the story of his Annapurna summit, he tells about how epic the climb was through falling rocks and physical exhaustion, and how he and Silvio made it to the top together. But as some in the Italian mountaineering community recalled, the details never quite aligned. According to expedition notes, the pair stopped at a 4 summit, roughly 40 minutes below the true top. While Silvio pushed on alone, Marco was too tired to continue and had waited behind. But when the story reached home, that small detail had vanished from Marco's narrative. He told the story again and again, his eyes unfocused, as if watching a film only he could see. By 2008, when Marco arrived at the base of K2, another peak he had to cross off his list of 14 26,000-foot summits, he had no idea how his fate was about to intertwine with an engineer, Gerard McDonnell. Engineers are typically found working in research facilities, corporate environments, or consulting firms. So what was this engineer doing on high-altitude peaks? Irishman Gerard McDonnell was a 27-year-old engineer when he moved across continents to icy Alaska. Jer, as his friends called him, would tell anyone that he had traveled to Alaska in 1998 for better job opportunities. Still, around that time, Ireland was going through something called the Celtic Tiger Boom, a period of rapid economic growth in Ireland that transformed the country from one of Europe's poorer states into one of its wealthiest. The truth is, it was the Alaskan peaks that truly called for him. Over the next 5 years, Jer had transformed from the proper city man who had never climbed a mountain to a highly experienced climber who already had his sights set on Mount Everest. The most striking change about Ger was the beard. It was no longer a carefully groomed beard of a city man, but a wild and thick growth that covered his jaw and cheeks. It was this very beard, combined with a deep kindness that never left his eyes, that led his fellow climbers to nickname him Jesus. In 2003, he joined an Irish expedition aiming for the summit of Mount Everest. Among his team was his fellow climber Mick Murphy. After his dedicated years of practice in the Alaska Range, Ger was ready for the greater ranges of the Himalayas. The climb was a classic Everest expedition via the South Col route in Nepal. The team had to go through a long process of slowly adjusting their bodies to function in the oxygen-starved air above 26,000 feet, known as the death zone. The physical toll it takes on climbers can be a lot, and in Ger's own words, he struggled deeply, having to deal with the thin air and the brutal cold on the mountain. Yet, within this struggle, Ger's spirit shone through. While others might have become withdrawn or singularly focused, Ger became the heart of the expedition. He was the one who would lighten the mood in a tense camp, and if he wasn't sharing a story, then he was serenading the camp with music. So, what made his summit success stand out? Well, it wasn't just that he reached to the top on May 26, 2003, it was how he did it and what it meant to him. His summit day was a brutal test of endurance. After a final push from the high camp at the South Col, Ger and his teammates achieved their goal. He stood on the summit of the world, looking out at a view few will ever see. But for a deeply thoughtful man like Ger, the summit was more than a tick on a list. While others were overwhelmed by the feeling of victory, Ger was overwhelmed with gratitude for the people who helped him achieve it, the Sherpa climbers. It was a rare perspective in a world where summits were considered personal victories, but that was the kind of man Ger was. As always, the descent was a fight against exhaustion, but Ger returned to base camp safely. As an Everester, he was now a member of one of the world's most exclusive clubs. Yet, the certificate and the title were not what he cherished most. He carried back with him a belief in teamwork, a respect for the mountain environment, and a confidence that he could operate at the very extremes of human endurance. Everest was the confirmation. It answered the question of whether he had the physical and mental fortitude for the highest peaks, but in doing so, it inevitably raised another, more dangerous one. What's next? In 2006, Ger climbed Broad Peak, where he excelled, reaching the summit before anyone else on the team. But that was just a warm-up for him. His main target was the K2. So as soon as he descended from Broad Peak, Ger made his way to the base camp of K2. What is it about K2 that called on Ger? Why would a man who had stood on the top of the world on Everest risk everything for this particular peak? Well, for Gerald, K2 was the ultimate test. For every 4 people who have reached its summit, 1 person has died trying. That statistic goes to show how difficult it can be to climb this savage mountain. Climbers have to deal with the unpredictable weather and the constant danger from falling chunks of ice and rock. It's also so complex that one wrong step could be the end. He was now so high on the mountain, breathing in the thin air that comes with extreme altitude, when something terrible happened. A large rock broke off the mountain and was coming fast at Gerald. How can a climber prepare for the unpredictable? They wear protective gear and make sure to have any supplies. Ger was fully protected, even wearing a climbing helmet. As he watched the rock headed for him, he knew in his guts that the force was going to hurt him. Yet, he couldn't help but hope his helmet would minimize the damage. When the rock finally hit Ger, it didn't just crush his helmet, it smashed directly into his skull, leaving him instantly stranded at extreme altitude levels with a severe head injury. Ger needed a hospital within an hour, otherwise he was going to die. Mick Murphy and Banjo Bannon, Ger's teammates, had watched the entire tragic scene play out. In that moment, they became Ger's lifeline, his only chance at survival. At first, they tried to help him descend, but getting down on your own is hard enough on K2. Time was running out, and it soon became obvious that they needed a helicopter. Helicopter evacuations are really risky at such an altitude, but with shaking hands, they immediately called for backup. Soon, the sound of raging helicopter blades penetrated the environment. Against all odds, Ger was successfully taken from the mountain and rushed to a hospital, where he received care immediately. The physical healing took weeks, first in Pakistan, and then back home in Alaska. But what about the psychological impact? For many, such a close brush with death would be a definitive end to the dream. But once more, Ger revealed his different mindset. He told his fellow climber, Alan Arnett, that instead of breaking him, the accident motivated him. He couldn't wait to head back again. Now, was this a true example of the resilience of a true mountaineer, or the beginning of a fatal obsession? Barely 2 years later, Ger was once again staring at the mountain that had once broken his body. His spirit, however, stayed high. No way he was going to back down unless he stood on its summit. The 2008 season saw several international teams on the mountain, including a Dutch team, a South Korean team, a Norwegian team, and independent climbers like Italy's Marco Confortola. The teams agreed to cooperate on fixing ropes for a safe ascent. It was during the long periods of acclimatization and waiting for a good weather window that Gerard McDonnell and Marco Confortola met and became friends. For a brief moment, two very different men found themselves roped together on the same path. Life at high altitude is brutally hard, and having someone with Ger's positive, brightening presence made a significant difference. The summit push began on August 1st, 2008. It was a scene of dozens of people rushing out with their gear and checking out the fixed ropes until someone noticed something wrong. The ropes were not fixed. The consequence was a deadly bottleneck of climbers, forced to wait as the precious, limited hours of daylight bled away. One by one, they inched upward, and from a sky view, they looked like a line of fireflies crawling up a hill. It was here that Ger climbed back into his own past. 2 years earlier, this very ice had been painted red with his own blood. Now, as his crampons bit into the slope, did he feel a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature? Did every scrape of ice against rope sound like the beginning of another avalanche in his mind? Was his heart beating a familiar rhythm against his ribs to the memory of his body being torn and broken? Well, if it did, Ger didn't show it. Marco can only recall an ever-smiling man, more concerned with the well-being of the other climbers. Eventually, on that Friday night, August 1st, 2008, both Marco Confortola and Gerard McDonnell stood on the summit of K2. For the experienced Marco, it was a monumental addition to his long list of climbing achievements, a key milestone for any professional high-altitude guide and mountaineer. But for Ger, it was a profound personal victory, a confirmation that he could conquer the mountain he had almost died on. They took pictures, grinning tiredly at their cameras, but the celebration was soon cut short. It was getting dark already, and a threatening cold wind began to claw at their exposed skin. And with every second they spent celebrating, the precious air in their oxygen tanks continued to run out. They had to leave. It was on their way down that things began to take a dangerous turn. In the unreliable section known as the bottleneck, a massive block of ice the size of a building collapsed without warning. The icefall swept away climbers and, most critically, severed the fixed ropes that were the lifeline for those still above. This left at least 17 climbers stranded, including Ger and Marco. They had barely made any progress descending. The fixed ropes were gone, and it was too dark for them to even try fixing anything. There was only one choice. They had to wait for daybreak, and that meant spending a night above 28,000 feet without shelter. Right there in the open, Marco desperately dug 2 small holes in the snow so he and Ger could camp for the night. They remained there with the hope that by dawn, their limbs wouldn't be too frostbitten to work. The next morning, both men moved out of their holes, exhausted and frostbitten, but deeply grateful. They had survived the night. The worst had happened. What more could go wrong? As they struggled to descend, they saw a tangle of ropes just below. 3 men were trapped within it. These were climbers from the Korean team, Hyo-gyung Kim, Jumik Boat, and Pasang Boat. It was a cruel sight. Some were hanging upside down, their heavy packs pulling them into inverted positions, and their limbs were twisted in the cords. At least 2 of them were no longer moving, their bodies stilled by the cold and the thin air. To make matters worse, they were not on a safe ledge, they were on a steep traverse. A single slip here would send a person thousands of feet down the face of the bottleneck. Gerard McDonnell and Marco Confortola stopped. They had just survived a night in the death zone. Their own survival depended on a quick descent. Yet, they could not walk past. For 3 hours, Ger and Marco worked hard to free the men. Their frozen fingers fumbled with knots, and their ice axes chipped at the frozen ropes. They pulled and pushed, trying to free the unconscious men. Yet, as much as they tried, their efforts seemed useless. And this is where the story enters its morally disputed chapter. At this point, Marco was completely spent and had reached his limit. He looked at his friend, Ger, still trying hard to save the men. But to Marco, the trapped climbers were beyond saving. And if he stayed, he was afraid to end up just like them. Marco and Ger agreed they'd descend together. That was the plan. They'd done what they could. It was time to save themselves. But when Marco began moving down the slope, Ger didn't follow. At first, Marco assumed his friend was right behind him. The fog was thick, visibility poor, and their radio contact was fading. But when he looked back, Ger was gone, still up there, somewhere near the bodies tangled in rope. That was the last time Marco saw him alive. Hours later, Marco reached the lower part of the bottleneck alone. His oxygen was gone, his feet were freezing, and every step felt like walking on knives. He barely made it to Camp 4, where rescuers later found him frostbitten and delirious. When the reporters came, he gave them a story. According to Marco, Ger had made a noble choice. He decided to stay behind to help 3 trapped climbers, and that was how he died. The narrative spread fast, the Irishman who sacrificed himself to save others. It was beautiful, tragic, and it made headlines all over the world. But in the days that followed, other versions of the story began to surface, and they didn't match Marco's version. Some climbers at lower camps said they'd seen Ger alive long after the time Marco claimed he died. Others insisted that Ger had continued helping injured climbers even after Marco descended, and that a second Serac collapse later swept him away. That's where the story begins to fracture. When Marco was asked later to clarify what happened, his answers shifted. In one interview, he said Ger had fallen. In another, he said Ger was frozen where he stood. In yet another, he claimed he never saw Ger again after the first collapse. His tone changed depending on who asked, and every retelling left new gaps. But when the cameras started rolling, Marco's version of events began to harden into something else, a story he could live with. In his press conference at Milan Airport, Marco Confortola told reporters he had stayed behind for 3 to 4 hours trying to help the trapped Korean climbers, saying, "It was something that just came from my heart. It was after that I paid the consequences." But the camera Gerard McDonnell had handed to Pemba Gyalje Sherpa before their summit told a different story. The photos later became key evidence suggesting it was Ger, not Marco, who had remained behind to help. Even the rescue logs conflicted with what Marco described. While he told the world Ger was already dead, satellite data and other climbers' testimonies suggested Ger was still alive for hours, possibly helping others, while Marco made his descent. Why did Marco's story keep changing? Was it trauma clouding his memory, or something more deliberate, an attempt to control the narrative before the truth caught up? It's not hard to imagine the pressure he faced. He was the only surviving professional guide on the mountain that day. Questions would naturally point toward him. Did he leave his friend behind to save himself, or did he truly believe Ger was gone? Those questions have never been answered. Even in Con Moriarty's reflective piece, the tone is careful, respectful of Ger's legacy, but aware of how vague and contradictory Marco's statements were. Moriarty never accuses him directly, but his inclusion of reports criticizing climbers for declaring others dead too soon feels pointed. What we know for sure is this: Gerard McDonnell was last seen alive near the fallen climbers, still trying to help, moments before another Serac collapsed. His body was later found higher on the slope than expected, evidence that he had stayed behind, not fallen. So the question remains, did Marco truly not know what happened to his friend? Or did he choose silence over the unbearable truth, that in the chaos of K2, he descended while Ger stayed to die? Either way, only one of them made it down. And ever since that day, Marco's story has never fully matched the mountain's silence. But what do you think really happened to Ger that day? And why did Marco's recollections match? It's August 12th, 2025. A Chinese climber named Guan Jing is descending from the summit of K2, the world's second highest mountain. She's just achieved her dream, standing on top of the Savage Mountain. The photos are incredible. She's exhausted, but glowing with pride. There's just one problem. She's about to enter what climbers call the death lottery. And in the next few minutes, Guan Jing would find out why anyone who truly understood what really happened on K2 that season would never set foot on that mountain again. Because the 2025 climbing season wasn't just strange and deadly, it was something far more disturbing. From climbers turning against each other in ways no one had ever seen before, to information that should have saved lives being deliberately hidden from the world. These are the untold truths behind K2's bizarre 2025 season. Picture this. You've spent 2 years of your life preparing for K2. You've mortgaged your house, quit your job, and trained until your body screamed for mercy. You arrive at base camp in June, expecting to see the familiar sight of snow-covered slopes stretching up toward the summit. Instead, you're staring at what looks like a completely different mountain. The mountain is brown where it should be white. Bare rock stretches up routes that should be covered in protective snow. And everywhere you look, you can see loose stones just waiting to break free and tumble down without warning. The Sherpa guides, men who'd been climbing K2 for 30 years, are walking around base camp with expressions no one had ever seen before. Not nervousness, not the usual pre-climb tension, but fear. Early reports coming back from scouts and climbers were chilling. In fact, one read like this: "Conditions are horrific below Camp 1. No snow at camp. Guides and rope fixers say it's the most dangerous they've ever seen. They worry about K2." Now, when Sherpa guides, people who've spent their entire lives on the world's most dangerous mountains, are telling you they've never seen anything this bad, that's when you know you're not dealing with normal climbing conditions anymore. What happened was this. The Karakoram Range was experiencing its worst drought in decades. The spring of 2025 had brought almost no snowfall to the region, and then record-breaking temperatures hit, 115 degrees Fahrenheit in areas that should have been cool mountain zones. The combination was devastating. Without the usual spring snow to create a protective layer, and with extreme heat melting what little snow remained, the entire lower section of K2 had been stripped bare. All that loose rock and debris that's normally held in place by tons of compacted snow was now completely exposed and unstable. And without that snow cover, K2 had transformed into a massive rockfall zone, where stones the size of bowling balls were constantly tumbling down the mountain. Every step was like playing Russian roulette with gravity. What the teams were looking at wasn't just a difficult climbing season, it was a mountain that climate conditions had fundamentally transformed into something no climber in modern history had ever encountered. But here's the thing that makes this story so disturbing. When faced with these obviously deadly conditions, most teams should have packed up and gone home. That would have been the smart, safe decision. Instead, they made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but would slowly drive some of them to the breaking point. They decided to stay and hope that somehow the mountain would become safer. Little did they know, the real nightmare was about to begin. So it's June 15th. You've been stuck at base camp on K2 for 3 weeks. Your food is running low. Your money is running out. But finally, there's a break in the weather. Time to move up. You pack your gear and start the climb to Camp 1. It takes you 6 hours of hard climbing through loose rocks. You're exhausted. All you want is to find a flat spot and set up your tent. But as you scan the campsite, something looks wrong. Very wrong. You see, Camp 1 sits at 20,000 feet on a slope of loose rock and scree, where finding flat ground for a tent is like finding parking in Manhattan. There are maybe a dozen decent spots where you can pitch a tent without sliding off a cliff in the middle of the night. Under normal circumstances, mountaineers follow an unwritten code that's been respected for decades. First come, first served. You get to camp, you find a spot, you set up your tent. Simple, respectful, the way climbers have always done it. But 2025 wasn't a normal year. This year, when other climbers arrived, exhausted and needing shelter, they found out that all the best camping spots were surrounded by poles and wire, like someone had built tiny prison camps around every piece of flat ground. What happened was this. Teams were arriving at Camp 1 and reserving the best spots for their other members by building physical barriers around them. Then they'd leave the spots empty while they went back down the mountain. So when other climbers arrived, exhausted and needing shelter, they found all the safe camping areas blocked off by wire fences, even though nobody was using them. One climber recorded and shared what they were seeing with French climber Serge Hardy. The footage shocked the mountaineering world. You could clearly see it, tents completely surrounded by wire barriers and snow poles, reserved like private plots on the mountain. The video is absolutely surreal. It looks like a militarized zone at 20,000 feet, not a climbing camp. When other climbers confronted the people doing this, they got a response that revealed just how competitive things had gotten. We're only trying to keep spots for our own teammates. To them, reserving spots for teammates in such extreme conditions was simply practical logistics, not malice. On K2, it is about survival. There are limited spaces, so whoever reaches camp first can put their tents up first. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. That's how climbing has always worked, but there was a big problem with that explanation. These teams weren't just putting up their tents first, they were claiming multiple spots and defending them with physical barriers, even when the owners weren't anywhere near the camp, while preventing the climbers who were there and needed shelter from using empty spaces. It's like showing up to a parking lot, putting cones around 5 empty spaces, and then driving away and leaving them all unused while other people circle around looking for somewhere to park. Except in this case, if you can't find a parking space for your tent on K2, you could literally die. One climber experienced something that shows just how twisted things had become. He left his tent at Camp 1 and went down the mountain for an acclimatization rotation. When he returned, he found wire barriers built around his own tent. Someone had literally fenced in his campsite while he was gone. Think about what that means. At 20,000 feet above sea level, in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, climbers were spending precious time and energy building barriers to keep other human beings away from shelter. And these weren't just random climbers making bad decisions. These were professional expedition companies with years of experience knowingly creating a system that put climbers at great risk. But the tent wars were just the beginning, because what was happening with communication on the mountain was even more disturbing. Because while teams were literally building barriers to keep each other away from shelter, something far more dangerous was happening in the shadows, something that would determine who lived and who died on K2 that season. Information was disappearing, and I'm not talking about teams keeping their summit strategies quiet. I'm talking about a complete breakdown in the sharing of critical safety information. Normally, on mountains like K2, when one team discovers that a route has become deadly, they immediately tell everyone else on the mountain. When guides get injured or rockfall increases, other expeditions know about it within hours, tops. It's not just good mountaineering etiquette, it's how people survive. But in 2025, that system completely collapsed. Part of this was due to technical problems. The northern territories of Pakistan, where K2 sits, are close to the disputed Kashmir region between India and Pakistan. Military tensions in the region meant that satellite communications were sometimes restricted or jammed entirely. Cell phone signals were unreliable at best. Teams would go days without being able to communicate with the outside world, let alone each other. Most teams rely on expensive satellite devices that work when they feel like it. But in 2025, even those systems were being disrupted. When your satellite device finally gets a signal, you get maybe a few minutes to send critical messages before losing connection again. Priority goes to emergency communications. Sharing routine safety information with other teams, that luxury was disappearing. But here's where this technical breakdown became something much more sinister. See, K2 expeditions aren't cheap. A single climbing permit costs thousands of dollars. Add in guides, equipment, food, and logistics, and most teams are looking at investments of $50,000 to $100,000 or more. For many climbers, this represents years of savings, second mortgages, or borrowed money they can't afford to lose. When you've invested that much in a single expedition, and you're competing with other teams for the same weather windows and summit opportunities, sharing information that might help your competitors starts to feel like giving away a competitive advantage. So in the communication vacuum that was created, some teams started making a calculated decision. Even when they could get messages through, they began deliberately withholding information that could save other people's lives. When experienced Sherpa guides got injured, some companies stopped reporting it publicly. They didn't want to alarm their clients or give competitors information about which routes were becoming more dangerous. When teams discovered that certain sections of the mountain had become significantly more difficult due to the drought conditions, they kept that knowledge to themselves. Even basic weather forecasts were being treated like trade secrets. Polish climber Łukasz Supergan was on the mountain that season, and what he witnessed should have been a wake-up call for everyone. He said, "Leaders keep their plans secret. Such cooperation is completely lacking." And as the weeks of waiting dragged on, with supplies running low and patience wearing thin, this culture of secrecy was about to turn deadly. By July, the situation on K2 had become desperate. Teams had been waiting at base camp for over 5 weeks. Supplies were running low. Motivation was cracking. The jet stream, a band of high-altitude winds present in the Himalayas region, had essentially parked itself over K2, making any summit attempt impossible. After 5 weeks of staring at a mountain that seemed determined to kill them, teams started breaking. Madison Mountaineering, one of the most respected American guide services, made the call first. Their lead guide, Terry Sylvester, looked at the rockfall conditions and the communication breakdown and said what many others were thinking but afraid to admit. "This isn't climbing anymore. This is suicide." They packed up and left. Mountain Professionals, another experienced company, followed suit. Even Mi'kmaq David Sherpa, who held the record for the most K2 summits, decided the mountain was too dangerous and abandoned his expedition. One by one, the exodus began. Teams that had spent years planning and saving for this moment were walking away from their dreams. By the first week of August, more than half of the climbers originally on the mountain had given up and started the long trek home. But a few teams remained, and on August 5th, when weather forecasters predicted a brief window of opportunity, those remaining teams made a decision that would haunt them forever. They decided to make one final, desperate summit push. The plan was simple in theory, terrifying in practice. They would climb up through the death zone during the coldest part of the night, when the rocks were most likely to stay frozen in place. Now remember, the lower sections of the mountain were still completely bare of snow, meaning constant rockfall, and the death zone is, of course, always deadly. But after weeks of waiting, they were out of time and out of options. It was Russian roulette with timing, and against all odds, it worked. On August 11th, 41 climbers, led by Mi'kmaq Ji of Imagine Nepal, reached the summit of K2. It was a rare August summit, the first since 2011. Among them were some incredible achievements. Mi'kmaq Ji tied the world record with his 6th K2 summit. Romanian Maria Alexandra Danila became the first Romanian woman to reach the top. Chinese climber Delicieti Alikuti unofficially became the youngest person ever to summit K2. For a few hours, it seemed like a triumph against impossible odds. But then came the descent, and that's when the risk of summiting finally revealed its true cost. The route between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp had become what climbers would later describe as a shooting gallery. Remember, this was the exact section of the mountain that had been stripped completely bare by the drought conditions. Without snow to hold the loose rocks in place, stones were falling constantly. There was no way to predict when or where the next boulder would come tumbling down. It was, quite literally, a lottery, and some climbers were about to draw the losing number. The first tragedy had actually happened weeks earlier. On July 18th, Pakistani high-altitude porter Iftikhar Hussain was struck by rockfall in this exact section while supporting an American expedition team. He was climbing with experienced Sherpa guides when an avalanche of rocks swept him away. His climbing partner, Dawa Fincho Sherpa, was injured and had to be evacuated by helicopter to Skardu for treatment. But that death had been kept relatively quiet. The communication blackout meant that many teams didn't fully understand how dangerous this section had become. Now, on August 12th, just one day after the successful summit push, the mountain was about to reveal just how dangerous climbing in 2025 was. Guan Jing wasn't some wealthy adventure tourist buying her way up K2. This 37-year-old woman from a small mountain village in China's Hunan province was basically a real-life superhero. She had started as a yoga instructor, but mountaineering had become her obsession, and her philosophy was simple: life should have no regrets. In spring 2024, she had climbed Mount Everest with Imagine Nepal, the same company guiding her on K2. But she didn't just climb Everest. When she reached the summit at 29,032 feet, she took off her gloves in negative 40-degree weather and performed a perfect headstand for 20 seconds. At the top of the world, where there's only 1/3 the oxygen your brain needs to function, this woman did a headstand. The video went viral across Chinese social media. This tiny woman perfectly balanced upside down while wearing full mountaineering gear at the literal top of the world. But here's what makes her K2 attempt even more remarkable. K2 was only her second major high-altitude peak. She was still relatively new to this level of extreme mountaineering. It's like going from successfully driving a race car on a straight highway to attempting the Monaco Grand Prix. And on August 11th, she had absolutely crushed it. At 3:32 p.m. Pakistan time, Guan Jing stood on the summit of K2. She had joined an exclusive club of fewer than 900 people in human history. Now she had to get back down alive. The descent had started exactly like it was supposed to. Guan made it through the bottleneck, that narrow corridor where 11 climbers died in 2008 when ice cliffs collapsed. She navigated the Black Pyramid's 2,000 vertical feet of technical rock climbing. She had successfully descended the most dangerous, most historically deadly sections of the world's most dangerous mountain. By the time she reached the section between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp, she was supposed to be in what climbers call the safe zone. This wasn't technical climbing anymore. Compared to everything she's just survived, it was basically just a hiking trail. So at 12:30 p.m. Pakistan time on August 12, 2025, Guan Jing was walking down that familiar path, probably feeling the best she'd felt in days. She'd conquered K2. She was hours away from hot tea and warm tents and the knowledge that she'd achieved something incredible. But somewhere high above her, a rock the size of a bowling ball broke free from the mountain and came tumbling down without warning and struck her in the head. Guan passed away instantly from the impact. In the space of a single heartbeat, her incredible achievement turned into an unspeakable tragedy. Both Iftikhar Hussein's and Guan Jing's passing occurred in the exact same location, and both were caused by the same problem: the unprecedented rockfall conditions created by drought and extreme heat that had defined the 2025 season. Now here's where this story gets really dark. After Guan Jing's death, her expedition company, Imagine Nepal, went completely silent. They didn't announce her death on their website. They didn't post about it on social media. They didn't respond to requests for comment from journalists. Alan Arnett, who had been covering the season extensively, noted, "I reached out to Imagine Nepal for a comment, but they did not respond to requests or mention her death on the site or social media." This wasn't just poor communication. It was almost like an active cover-up. A woman had died on their expedition, and they were pretending it hadn't happened. But it gets worse. When recovery teams went up to retrieve Guan Jing's body, one of the recovery team members was also injured by rockfall. The mountain was so dangerous that even the rescue operations were putting more lives at risk. Meanwhile, the climbing companies that had stayed on the mountain were trying to spin the narrative. Despite the deaths, the extreme conditions, and the near-constant rockfall, they were promoting their successful summits as triumphs of human determination. Mingma Ji, who had led the final summit push, was being celebrated for his record-tying 6th K2 summit. The media was focusing on the achievements and downplaying the casualties. But behind the scenes, serious questions were being asked. How had conditions been allowed to get so dangerous? Why hadn't more teams turned back when the risks became obvious? And why were companies hiding critical safety information from each other and from the public? The 2025 K2 season exposed the ugly truth about what commercial mountaineering had become. Companies were willing to let climbers face unnecessary danger rather than share information that might hurt their business. They prioritized their reputations over human lives, and when people inevitably got hurt, it was treated as just another acceptable casualty of climbing the world's most dangerous mountain. K2 has always been deadly. That's nothing new. The Savage Mountain earned its reputation long before 2025, but the deaths of Iftikhar Hussein and Guan Jing weren't just the mountain's usual toll. The drought conditions, the communication blackouts, the tent wars, the hoarding of safety information, all of these human failures had turned an already dangerous mountain into something far more lethal than it needed to be. But you know what? There were heroes in this story too. Real heroes who chose integrity over glory and safety over summits. Terry Sylvester, the lead guide for Madison Mountaineering, made the decision to end his expedition after reaching Camp 1. Despite having Ryan Mitchell, a popular climber with a huge social media following, on his team, Sylvester looked at the rockfall conditions and said, "No, this is too dangerous." Ryan Mitchell was devastated. He'd spent years preparing for K2. He documented his entire journey on social media. His fans were expecting him to summit. But Sylvester chose his client's life over his reputation, and they headed home. Other heroes emerged during the rescue operations. When Polish climber Waldemar Kowalewski broke his leg at 6,500 meters on nearby Broad Peak, 3 Nepalese Sherpas volunteered for an incredibly dangerous rescue mission. They climbed unacclimatized to save a stranger's life, risking their own safety in the process. And there were heroes in the medical community too. Pakistani climber Niyala had worked with the government to establish semi-permanent medical facilities near K2 base camp. These camps provided free healthcare to porters and climbers, likely saving multiple lives during the expeditions. The Pakistani government also made significant reforms. The cost of helicopter rescues was reduced from $26,000 to under $10,000, making emergency evacuations more accessible. New policies were implemented requiring only 1 helicopter for rescues instead of 2, streamlining the process. But perhaps the biggest hero was the mountain itself. K2 had revealed the truth about what happens when commercial pressures override safety considerations. When competition becomes more important than cooperation. When summit fever clouds judgment to the point where people are willing to risk everything for a photo at the top. The 2025 K2 season officially ended with 41 summits and 2 deaths, a fatality rate of nearly 5%. To put that in perspective, that's almost 5 times higher than Everest's death rate. More importantly, it exposed fundamental problems in how commercial mountaineering operates on the world's most dangerous peaks. The secretive nature of the season, the breakdown in information sharing, and the willingness of some companies to continue operations in clearly dangerous conditions raise serious questions about the industry's priorities. Since the season ended, there have been calls for major reforms, better communication requirements between teams, mandatory sharing of safety information, stricter government oversight of expedition companies. Some have even suggested that climbs should be automatically canceled when conditions reach certain danger thresholds, because the summit will always be there. But the people trying to reach it won't be, unless we start putting their safety first. Some stories are written in snow and ice, but the lessons of K2's bizarre 2025 season are written in something much more permanent. The memories of the people who lived through it, and the legacy of those who didn't make it home. It was August 12th, 2025, and Guan Jing was exhausted but happy. She'd just done something about only 900 people in human history had ever accomplished. She'd climbed to the top of K2 and lived to tell about it. But as she walked down the safe zone in the darkness, thinking of a warm meal and a warm bed, she had no idea that something was tumbling towards her. Something that would make climbing K2 in 2025 challenge everything experts thought they knew about mountain safety. And what happened next to Guan and another climber a month earlier in the exact same spot would be so shocking that professional expedition teams would literally pack up and abandon the mountain. Today, I'm covering 2025 K2 deaths that are nearly unbelievable. And by the end of this story, you'll see exactly why the safe climbing zones might not be safe anymore. This 37-year-old woman from a small mountain village in China's Hunan province was basically a real-life superhero. She had started as a yoga instructor, but mountaineering had become her obsession. Her philosophy was simple: life should have no regrets. In spring 2024, she had climbed Mount Everest with Imagine Nepal, one of the most respected guiding companies in the world. But she didn't just climb it. When she reached the summit at 29,032 feet, she took off her gloves in negative 40-degree weather and performed a perfect headstand for 20 seconds. At the top of the world, where there's only 1/3 the oxygen your brain needs to function, this woman did a headstand, which is basically like doing gymnastics while suffocating. The video went absolutely viral across Chinese social media, and honestly, Who wouldn't want to watch this tiny woman perfectly balanced upside down while wearing full mountaineering gear at the literal top of the world? But here's what makes her K2 attempt even more remarkable. K2 was only her second major 26,000-foot peak. She was still relatively new to this level of extreme mountaineering, so when she decided to attempt K2 in 2025, she was basically going from Everest, which is high but relatively straightforward, to what many consider the most technically difficult mountain on Earth. It's like going from successfully driving a race car on a straight highway to attempting the Monaco Grand Prix. Sure, both involve high speeds and danger, but one is infinitely more complex and deadlier than the other. Everest is about endurance and altitude. It's brutal, but it follows a predictable pattern. K2 is about technical climbing skill, perfect weather timing, and pure survival instinct, all rolled into one nightmare package. And somehow, she planned to make it work. And here's where Guan's story gets really incredible and really, really terrifying. Because K2 in 2025 wasn't just dangerous, it was apocalyptic. The Karakoram region had experienced something that climate scientists were calling unprecedented. The winter had been abnormally dry. Winter and early spring, the season when K2 usually builds its snowpack, barely delivered a thing. Then summer arrived with record-breaking heat waves. What this meant was that all the snow and ice that normally holds K2's rock faces together had melted away. Professional expedition leaders started describing the mountain as a shooting gallery, where loose rocks were constantly tumbling down the slopes. Areas that had been stable for decades were suddenly death traps. Professional teams started abandoning the mountain. Madison Mountaineering, one of the most respected guiding companies in the world, packed up and went home after reaching Camp 1. Mountain professionals did the same thing. Team after team made the same decision. K2 in 2025 was simply too dangerous to climb. But Guan's team, Imagine Nepal, led by the legendary Mingma G Sherpa, decided to stay. Now, you might be wondering why one of the most experienced Sherpa guides in the world would risk it when other professionals were running away. But the thing about Mingma G is that he's not just any guide. This guy has summited K2 multiple times and knows the mountain better than almost anyone alive. He'd been monitoring the conditions closely, and he knew that if they waited for the perfect weather window and moved fast, they could make it work. Plus, his team had been part of the rope-fixing effort, so they knew exactly what they were dealing with on every section of the route. It was a calculated gamble by one of the best in the business, and on August 11th, after weeks of waiting for the right weather window, they finally got their shot. Guan, with the rest of her team, started her summit push in the darkness, her headlamp cutting through the night as she climbed toward the top of the world's most dangerous mountain. And you know what? She absolutely crushed it. Her journey upwards was smooth, so smooth that around 3:32 p.m. Pakistan time on August 11th, Guan Jing stood on the summit of the Savage Mountain. She had done it. She had joined an exclusive club of fewer than 900 people in human history. It was and still is quite an achievement worth celebrating. But here's the thing about K2. Reaching the summit is only half the battle. Now, she had to get back down alive. The descent started exactly like it was supposed to. Guan and her teammates were tired, obviously. They'd been in what mountaineers call the death zone for over 20 hours, but they were moving steadily, clipped into the fixed ropes, following proper descent protocol. First, they had to get back down through the bottleneck. Now, the bottleneck is this narrow corridor of ice at 26,200 feet and only about 10 feet wide, with a massive ice cliff hanging directly above it. This ice cliff, called a serac, is basically the size of a city building that can collapse at any moment without any warning whatsoever. And it has collapsed before, in fact, multiple times. In August 2008, 11 climbers died on K2 when a serac in the bottleneck suddenly broke free without warning, sweeping away all the fixed ropes and trapping climbers in the death zone overnight in minus 40-degree temperatures. They had to choose between waiting for a rescue that might never come or trying to descend thousands of feet of technical terrain in complete darkness without any ropes to guide them. Most of them froze to death before morning. But somehow, Guan made it through. One careful, deliberate step at a time, testing each foothold Double-checking each clip into the fixed line, she descended through what many experienced climbers consider the most consistently dangerous 300 feet on the entire planet. Next came the Black Pyramid, another 2,000 vertical feet of steep, technical rock climbing back down to around 24,000 feet. This section has claimed its own share of victims over the decades. Climbers have fallen here when pure exhaustion caused them to make simple, stupid mistakes they wouldn't normally make, like missing an obvious handhold, clipping into the wrong anchor point, or just losing their balance on terrain they could have climbed easily at sea level. Every single handhold had to be perfect, every movement calculated, because one slip, one moment of inattention, one cramp in your leg or fumble with your gear means you're tumbling thousands and thousands of feet straight down the mountain face with absolutely nothing to stop your fall. But Guan moved methodically, like the professional she was, testing each hold, staying clipped in at all times, following the fixed ropes that had saved countless lives over the years and failed to save so many others. Then, finally, she was out of K2's legendary death zone entirely. Below 26,000 feet, her body could finally start to function to something resembling normal again. Her brain could think clearly for the first time in almost a full day. Her muscles actually responded to what she was telling them to do, instead of just cramping up or going numb. By the time they reached Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, something truly incredible had happened. Guan had successfully descended the most dangerous, most technically challenging, most historically deadly sections of the world's most dangerous mountain. She had survived the bottleneck where 11 people died in a single day. She had navigated the Black Pyramid and had made it through the death zone safely. This is where climbers traditionally breathe a massive sigh of relief, where they start thinking about survival instead of just the next handhold. It's where teams often joke about being back in the land of the living. After all, the worst dangers are supposed to be behind them. The hours ticked by at Camp 1, 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m. Guan and her team rested, melted snow for water, maybe grabbed some food. The kind of normal, boring stuff that climbers do when they're not actively trying not to die. Around 10 p.m. Pakistan time on August 12th, they started the next leg of their descent, from Camp 1 down to Advanced Base Camp. And this is where something interesting happens in the psychology of mountain climbing. See, this section between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp is what most mountaineers call the safe zone. It's only about 3,000 feet of descent, dropping from 19,900 feet down to around 16,700 feet. For most people, 16,700 feet is still incredibly high, higher than any mountain in the lower 48 states. But for someone who's just spent the last day and a half above 26,000 feet, 16,700 feet feels like being back at sea level by comparison. This is the section where climbers finally, truly relax, where they unclip from some of the fixed ropes because the terrain isn't technical anymore, where they start pulling out their phones to call home and tell their families, "I made it," where they begin thinking about hot showers and real food and sleeping in an actual bed instead of just survival. The route here isn't particularly steep. There's no technical rock climbing, no narrow ridges, no hanging ice cliffs waiting to collapse. Compared to the dangers at other K2 sections, it's basically a hiking trail. But here's the problem. It's a hiking trail built on top of a geological disaster waiting to happen. See, Camp 1 on most other Himalaya mountains is considered the safest camp on the entire mountain. It's where climbers go to recover, to rest, to let their bodies readjust. On Everest, on Cho Oyu, on most of the big peaks, Camp 1 is where you breathe easy. But K2 doesn't follow the rules. The entire section from Camp 1 down to Advanced Base Camp sits on loose scree and unstable rock formations. There's no protective snow cover like on other mountains, no solid rock faces to deflect debris. It's just loose, crumbling stone that's easy to walk on, but sits on top of an incredibly unstable foundation. The 2025 conditions made this infinitely worse. With all that missing snow and ice that normally acts like glue, the whole mountainside had basically turned into a giant pile of loose rocks, just waiting for the right trigger to come tumbling down. So, as Guan walked down this familiar path in the darkness, her headlamp cutting through the night, She was probably feeling pretty good. She'd just accomplished something that fewer than 900 people in human history had ever done. She'd survived the bottleneck, the Black Pyramid, the death zone. She was supposed to be in the safe zone now, just a few hours away from advanced base camp, where there would be hot tea and warm tents and the knowledge that she'd conquered the savage mountain. But as she walked down that path, something was happening high above her in the darkness that she couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't prepare for, because somewhere high above Guan, maybe 2,000 feet up the mountain face, something had shifted. It started small, maybe just a tiny piece of ice that had been holding a larger rock in place, finally melted away from that day's heat. Maybe the rock face had expanded and contracted one too many times from the extreme temperature swings. Maybe it was just gravity finally winning a battle it had been fighting for months. Whatever the cause, a piece of stone, dark, jagged, roughly the size of a bowling ball, broke free from the mountain. At first, it just sat there for a moment, balanced on the edge of a small ledge. Then it rolled forward slightly and began to fall. The first few feet were almost gentle. The rock bounced softly off a small outcropping, spun in the air for a second, and then hit the slope again. But with each bounce, each impact with the mountain face, it picked up speed. And with each additional foot it fell, the laws of physics took over completely. 10 feet down the mountain, it was moving fast enough to shatter into pieces when it hit a larger boulder. 50 feet down, it was moving fast enough to sound like a gunshot when it struck solid rock. 100 feet down the mountain face, that bowling ball-sized piece of stone was now traveling faster than a car on the highway, and it was heading directly towards the route that every single climber uses to descend from Camp 1 to Advanced Base Camp, right towards Guan. Meanwhile, about 1,500 feet below, Guan was having what was probably one of the best moments of her entire life after summiting K2. She was moving at a steady pace down the familiar trail, her headlamp beam dancing across the loose rocks and scree ahead of her. Her breathing was finally normal again. Well, as normal as it gets at 17,000 feet. Her legs felt strong. Her mind was clear. For the first time in over 30 hours, she wasn't actively worried about dying. Behind her, she could probably hear the quiet conversations of her teammates, maybe the soft clinking of carabiners and gear as they moved down the same route. Ahead of her, the lights of Advanced Base Camp were still hidden around a bend in the trail, but she knew they were there. Hot tea, warm sleeping bags, the celebration that comes with surviving one of the most dangerous mountains on Earth. Maybe she heard sharp cracks echoing through the darkness as the rock broke free from the mountain face high above. Or maybe the sound got lost in the wind and the normal noises of the mountain at night. Either way, there was nothing she could have done about what happened next. Because as Guan took another step on the trail, a sudden crack tore through the night. Before anyone could shout or move, a rock came out of the dark and slammed into her at 150 miles per hour. And that was it. The impact crushed her skull instantly. According to the Alpine Club of Pakistan, she died from severe head trauma caused by the falling rock. There was no chance of survival. No moment of pain. No time to understand what was happening. 1 second she was walking and thinking about her future. The next second, she was gone. I can only imagine what flashed through her mind in that split second of contact, or if anything did at all. Maybe she saw a flash of movement in her peripheral vision. Maybe she had just enough time to think, what was that? Before everything went black. Or maybe it happened so fast that her brain never even registered what was happening. Recovery efforts for her body took days. The weather was too unstable for helicopters to safely reach the accident site, and a ground team had to be sent up on foot. One of the rescuers was even injured during the recovery operation and had to be evacuated himself. Just like that, a woman who had conquered Everest, who had become internet famous for doing a headstand at 29,000 feet, who had successfully summited one of the world's most dangerous mountains, was killed by a random rock in the place where she was supposed to be safe. But here's what makes this whole thing absolutely insane. Guan wasn't the first person this happened to. 1 month earlier, a Pakistani porter named Iftikhar Hussain had walked down this exact same path, and what happened to him should have been impossible. Now, you need to understand something about Pakistani high-altitude porters. These aren't just guys carrying loads for wealthy foreigners. They're the backbone of every major expedition. They know these peaks better than anyone because they grew up in their shadows. Their fathers climbed them, and their grandfathers before them. When a Pakistani porter dies on his home mountain, it's not just a tragedy for his family, it's a warning to the world. Iftikhar Hussain was 34 years old, from Sadpara village in Skardu. This village sits literally in the shadow of K2. He'd grown up looking at this mountain every single day of his life. He'd been working as a high-altitude porter for years, supporting expeditions on K2, Broad Peak, and the other giants of the Karakoram. He wasn't some inexperienced newcomer. He was exactly the kind of local expert that makes high-altitude expeditions possible. On July 19th, 2025, Hussain was part of a 4-member team working for Mountain Professionals, one of the most respected guiding services in the world. They were doing routine work, carrying supplies between camps, maintaining equipment, the kind of unglamorous but essential tasks that keep expeditions running. And just like Guan would a month later, he was descending from Camp 1 toward Advanced Base Camp, the exact same route, the exact same safe zone where climbers let their guard down. At around 12:30 p.m. that Friday afternoon, Hussain and his team were moving through what climbers call the shooting gallery, that same section between Camp 1 and Advanced Base Camp where loose rocks regularly fall down the mountainside. But here's the thing. This section isn't supposed to have major avalanche danger. It's dangerous from rockfall, sure, but massive avalanches? That's not supposed to happen here. But on July 19th, 2025, without any warning, about 1,000 feet above, the unthinkable happened. A massive slab of ice and snow broke free from the mountain face in a place where avalanches don't usually occur. As the avalanche roared down the mountainside, it picked up rocks, ice chunks, debris. Anything in its path became part of an increasingly deadly torrent. Thousands of pounds of frozen material rushing down the slope at incredible speed, all headed straight for Hussain and his 3 teammates. Meanwhile, Hussain was working alongside Dawa Finjo Sherpa and Dawa Geljan Sherpa from Nepal, plus another Pakistani porter named Niaz Ali. They were probably just having a normal conversation, maybe talking about the weather or their families back home, when they heard it. That low, rumbling sound that every mountain climber fears. The sound of the mountain coming apart above them. There was no time to think. When an unexpected avalanche hits you that high up, there's usually no time to plan. They had maybe 10 seconds to react. 10 seconds to try to get out of the way of thousands of tons of snow, ice, and rock barreling down toward them. Dawa Finjo Sherpa got caught in the slide and was severely injured, but somehow survived. Dawa Geljan Sherpa and Niaz Ali were swept up too, but managed to escape with minor injuries. But Iftikhar, the local expert, took the full force of the avalanche, and sadly, he did not survive. The rescue team dispatched from base camp found him buried under tons of snow and debris. They dug frantically, knowing that every second counted, but it was already too late. The mountain had claimed one of its own. What followed was a desperate evacuation that shows just how remote and dangerous this terrain really is. Dawa Finjo Sherpa, badly injured but alive, had to be helicoptered to Skardu Hospital. The weather was so bad that it took multiple attempts before a Pakistani army helicopter could even reach them. Meanwhile, Hussain's body was recovered and brought down to base camp, then flown back to his family in Sadpara village for burial. His death left behind a wife and children who depended on his income from high-altitude work. Here's what these deaths reveal about what's happening to our planet's most extreme environments. K2 has always been deadly, long before these cases. The Savage Mountain was already the most dangerous mountain on Earth. Everest might be higher, but K2 has always been meaner. Sharper slopes, fiercer storms, fewer rescue options. For decades, 1 in every 4 climbers who reached the summit never came back down. But now, it's becoming something even more terrifying. Because here's the thing, K2's deaths usually happened in predictable places. The bottleneck, where ice cliffs collapse. The death zone above 26,000 feet, where your body shuts down. During storms or in technical climbing sections, where one wrong move kills you. What's happening now is completely different. climate change isn't just melting glaciers and raising sea levels, it's turning the world's most predictable mountain dangers into something we've never seen before. Rising temperatures are literally pulling apart rock faces that have been solid for centuries. Weather patterns that mountaineers have used for route planning for decades are completely breaking down. The safe zones that climbers have relied on for generations are becoming death traps. And here's how you know something is seriously wrong. In 2025, only about 40 people summited K2. 40. Compare that to Everest, where over 600 people reach the summit every single year. Professional expedition teams that have invested tens of thousands of dollars and months of planning are literally walking away from the mountain because it's too dangerous to climb. And when people who make their living taking calculated risks on the world's most dangerous peaks start saying, nope, not this year, you know something fundamental has changed. Guan Jing believed life should have no regrets. She pushed herself to achieve incredible things, from mastering yoga to conquering the world's highest peaks. Iftikhar Hussain was supporting his family through his work as a high-altitude porter. He was doing what his father probably did, and his father before him, helping foreign climbers achieve their dreams while risking everything to support his community. And both passed away in a place where they should have been celebrating, not fighting for their lives. And this is why their deaths are so unbelievable. These weren't deaths from summit fever or poor judgment or taking stupid risks. These weren't deaths in the places where mountaineers expect to die. These were deaths that broke every rule about how mountains work. So what happens next? Do climbers stop climbing K2? Do they accept that some mountains are becoming too dangerous, even for the world's best climbers? Do we acknowledge that climate change is making our most challenging peaks impossible? What do you think? It's August 13th, 2010. A weather-beaten Austrian mountaineer makes a satellite phone call from K2 base camp to his support team back home. When they picked up, his voice trembled with joy and tears as he announced, "I did it." This was Christian Stangl, and he just accomplished one of the most extraordinary feats of climbing, a solo speed ascent of K2, the world's most dangerous mountain. His team erupts in jubilation. The summit photos were breathtaking. Every mountaineering magazine in Europe wanted his story. This was the achievement of a lifetime. There was just one problem. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. And sometimes when something seems too good to be true, it's because it is. And what happened next would expose a problem that goes much deeper than one man's ambition. A problem that reveals what desperation can drive even the world's most experienced climbers to do. From an Austrian speed climber whose record attempt defied physics, to a Spanish doctor who came within 39 feet of K2's summit. These are the biggest K2 lies ever caught on camera. So Christian Stangl steps out of his tent at K2 base camp on August 13th, 2010. He's exhausted. He's been on this mountain for weeks, and he's about to make the most consequential phone call of his life. Now, before I tell you what happened on that phone call, you need to understand who Christian Stangl was. This wasn't some random guy who decided to climb a mountain on the weekend. Christian was a professional mountain guide from Austria who had been climbing for over 20 years. He had major sponsors like Mammoth backing him. He'd already climbed 3 of the world's 14 highest peaks, all without any hint of controversy. But Christian wasn't just a high-altitude climber, he was a speed demon. In 2006, he climbed from Everest base camp to the summit in just 16 hours and 42 minutes. That's not just fast, that's superhuman. In the Andes, he was absolutely unstoppable. In the late 1990s, he climbed 9 peaks over 19,600 feet in just 18 days. Then he came back and did 10 20,000-foot peaks over 7 days in 2005. Then in 2008, he pushed it even further and climbed 4 peaks over 19,600 feet in 1 day. Many called him the Sky Runner because he didn't just climb mountains, he ran up them. While other climbers were taking weeks to acclimatize and slowly work their way up, Christian was setting speed records that seemed to defy the laws of physics. So when Christian announced his 7-second summits project back in the mid-2000s, the mountaineering world barely batted an eye. I mean, this was Christian Stangl we're talking about. The 7-second summits challenge basically was that he wanted to be the first person to climb the second highest mountain on every continent, and he wanted to do it faster than anyone had ever done before. It was quite an ambitious project for any mountaineer, but if anyone could pull this off, it was him. By 2010, he'd already conquered two second mountains, Aconcagua in South America and Mount Vinson in Antarctica, and as you'd expect, he had set speed records on both continents. So, on paper, K2 should have been just another checkbox for Christian, the second highest mountain in Asia, the third piece of his ambitious puzzle. But K2 was different. K2 is not Everest. Everest might be taller, but K2 is meaner. While Everest kills people because of overcrowding and bad decisions, K2 just kills people, period. The mountain has a fatality rate of approximately 25%, meaning 1 out of every 4 climbers who attempt it dies on the mountain. Do you know what that means? It means that if you and 3 of your best friends decide to climb K2, statistically, 1 of you isn't coming home. That's 25% death rate. While Everest's death rate hovers around 1%, and most fatalities occur in the death zone above 26,000 feet, K2 can kill climbers at all elevations through objective hazards. Avalanches come out of nowhere and sweep entire climbing teams into oblivion. Ice walls collapse without warning. The weather can turn deadly in literally minutes. Unlike Everest, which has established weather windows and extensive infrastructure, K2 offers no margin for error and virtually no rescue possibilities above base camp. And Christian knew this better than most people, because 2 years earlier, in 2008, he had been on K2 when one of the worst mountaineering disasters in history happened. 11 people died in a single day when an ice avalanche destroyed all the safety ropes in a section called the bottleneck. Christian barely got out alive. So now, it's 2010, and Christian is back on this mountain that almost killed him. He's been there for weeks, and the conditions have been absolutely terrible. Other climbing teams have given up and gone home. The mountain is basically closed because of dangerous weather and unstable snow. But despite this, on August 13th, Christian picks up his satellite phone and calls his support team back in Austria. And when they answer, his voice is shaking, whether from exhaustion, altitude, or pure adrenaline. And he says the words that would change everything. I did it. I summited K2 solo in 70 hours. Now, his team back in Austria goes absolutely crazy. They're celebrating. They're calling the media because what Christian is claiming is almost impossible. A solo speed ascent of K2 in 70 hours? That's not just breaking a record. That's rewriting what's humanly possible. The story exploded across the mountaineering world. X-Web, the most respected climbing news site, ran it as their lead story. Climbing magazine featured it prominently. European mountaineering publications went ballistic for multiple reasons. This was the only successful K2 summit of the entire 2010 season, and it was achieved by one of their own in record-breaking time. And Christian had the photo to prove it. There he was, standing on the summit of K2, looking tired but triumphant, with all those Pakistani peaks stretching out behind him. The image was stunning. Exactly what you'd expect to see from a mountaineer standing on the top of the world's most dangerous mountain. The photo looked legitimate. The background matched what you'd expect to see from K2's summit. His gear looked authentic. Everything seemed to check out. Except it didn't. Within hours of that photo being released, mountaineers all over the world are staring at their computer screens, and something just doesn't feel right. See, there are these online forums where serious climbers hang out. And these people know mountains. They've been to K2. They know what the summit looks like. So they start comparing Christian's photo to other summit photos from K2. And they notice something weird. The background doesn't match. Now, this isn't like spotting a difference in 2 pictures in a kid's magazine. These people are analyzing the angle of the sun, the shadows, and the way the other mountains line up in the distance. And they immediately found problems. The angle was wrong. The perspective was off. The lighting suggested the photo had been taken at a completely different altitude, possibly up to 3,000 feet lower than the actual summit. But here's the thing. Christian Stangl wasn't some amateur. This was a guy who had been climbing for decades. If he was going to fake a summit photo, Surely he would have done a better job than this, right? Well, XWeb, which is basically the most respected mountaineering news website in the world, was putting together this detailed analysis showing that Christian's photo is fake. They've got experts, GPS data, and comparisons to dozens of other summit photos. This is about to be the most devastating expose in mountaineering history. But before they publish it, they do what good journalists do. They give Christian one last chance to comment. They call him up and basically say, "Hey, we're about to prove that your photo is fake. Do you have anything to say?" And that's when Christian Stangl does something that nobody saw coming. He cracked. Instead of fighting the allegations or providing additional evidence, he confessed. Not in some private phone call, not in a quiet statement to his sponsors. Christian goes on Austrian state television, ORF, which is like the BBC of Austria, and in front of the entire country, he admits that he never reached the summit of K2. But here's where it gets really weird. His explanation for why he lied is almost more shocking than the lie itself. Christian claimed he had entered what he called a trance-like state brought on by stress and the fear of failure. He said that in this confused mental condition, he had genuinely convinced himself that he had reached the summit, even though he hadn't. The summit photo, he admitted, had been taken at Camp 3, approximately 3,000 feet below the actual summit. Now, I'm sure you're wondering if this is really possible or just some elaborate fluke. Well, here's the thing. I did some research, and there are legitimate medical conditions that could explain what Christian claimed happened to him. At extreme altitudes, your brain gets starved of oxygen, which can cause serious problems. Confusion, memory issues, poor judgment, even hallucinations. Add in days of sleep deprivation, life-threatening stress, and the crushing fear of failure, and your mind can start playing some pretty serious tricks on you. There's something called acute stress response, where people under extreme psychological pressure can experience what's called dissociation. Basically, they feel detached from reality or their own actions. In severe cases, people can even create false memories to cope with trauma. This can happen to anybody, including mountain climbers. It affects high-performance athletes under crushing pressure, military personnel in combat situations, and really anyone pushed to their absolute breaking point. So medically speaking, it's possible that Christian's mind could have created this false reality to protect him from the devastating reality of failure. But here's the problem with that explanation. Christian didn't just have vague memory of reaching the summit, he had a detailed story. He had the photo ready to go. He made coordinated phone calls to his team with specific times and details. So was he truly in a trance, even for a moment, or was this just a really elaborate lie that he thought he could get away with? I'll let you decide. When the news broke, the mountaineering community, as you'd expect, just exploded. People who had known Christian for decades couldn't believe it. This was a guy they respected, a guy they trusted, and now he's admitting to one of the most elaborate lies in climbing history. Other climbers at base camp that season start talking, and what they're saying is that they never saw any evidence that Christian had climbed higher than Camp 1, which was barely off the ground level of the mountain. No footprints in the snow above the lower camps. No one saw him making any serious summit attempts. Some even started wondering if Christian had even tried to climb K2 that year, or if the whole thing was made up from the beginning, using old photos from his previous expeditions. His sponsors had to decide what to do. Some stuck with him, saying they understood the pressure he was under. Others quietly cut ties and distanced themselves from the scandal. Now, most people caught in a lie this big would disappear, maybe move to another country, change careers, never speak of mountaineering again. But Christian Stangl did something that nobody expected. 2 years later, in 2012, he went back to K2, and this time, he actually climbed it. On July 12, 2012, Christian and a Polish climber named Adam Bilecki started their summit push from Camp 3 at about 24,000 feet. And 23 hours later, they were standing on the real summit of K2. But Christian wasn't taking any chances this time. He knew everyone would be watching. Everyone would be skeptical. So he took GPS coordinates 21 times during the climb. He recorded a 360-degree video from the summit. He documented everything. The redemption was complete. The man who had been exposed as a fraud had returned to face his demons and genuinely conquer the mountain that had broken him. "It feels like I have been reborn," Stangl said after his successful descent. And you know what? I believe him, because it takes incredible courage to go back to the place where you failed so publicly, where you humiliated yourself in front of the entire world, and actually do the thing you lied about doing. But Christian Stangel's story was just the beginning, because 3 years earlier, another K2 fraud had unfolded that was even more controversial, even more strange, and somehow even more complicated. It's July 19th, 2009, and Jorge Egoiaga is standing closer to the summit of K2 than he has ever been in his life. Now, Jorge wasn't some adrenaline junkie looking for his next thrill. This guy was a 42-year-old Spanish doctor. He specialized in sports medicine and taught at the University of Oviedo. He was an experienced climber, often serving as an expedition physician and participating in high-altitude rescues. At that time, he had already climbed 8 of the world's 14 highest peaks. In other words, this was a man who had spent years climbing mountains and was really, really good at it. But K2 had been his white whale, this nearly impossible dream he couldn't let go of. He'd first tried to climb it back in 2001 and failed, but now, after weeks of climbing, after months of preparation, after years of dreaming about this moment, he was almost there. Almost. Jorge looked up at those final few feet to the summit, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The summit was covered in what climbers call wind slab, basically snow that looks solid but is actually hollow underneath. And when Jorge stepped on it, it made this crunching sound that every experienced mountaineer knows means one thing: danger. One wrong step and that snow could collapse, sending him thousands of feet to his death. So Jorge Egoiaga made a decision that would haunt him for the next 14 years. He stopped, he took a photo showing where he is, just 39 feet from the summit, and recorded his GPS coordinates. Then he turned around and started climbing down. Now, for Jorge, this felt like the right decision. He had climbed K2. He had proven to himself that he could do it. The fact that he chose to live rather than take an unnecessary risk for the sake of touching the highest point seemed smart, mature, and responsible. Okay, you know we've told many death stories of climbers who took unnecessary risks, and the comment section is almost always about how they could have just turned back and saved their lives, like Jorge did. But when word got back to his climbing partner named Martin Ramos at base camp, something got lost in translation. See, Martin sees Jorge's photo, and it looks like he's on the summit. The background looks right, and Jorge looks triumphant. So Martin starts telling people that Jorge has successfully summited K2. The Spanish media picks up the story. Jorge Egoiaga had become one of the few people to summit K2 without oxygen, and one of even fewer to do it solo. Back in Spain, he's being hailed as a hero. For a few days, Jorge is one of the most celebrated mountaineers in the world. But other climbers at K2 base camp that season are skeptical. The conditions had been absolutely terrible. Multiple expeditions had been forced to abandon their summit attempts. The weather was so bad that most people thought anyone attempting the summit was basically committing suicide. And here is where it gets worse. When journalists start asking Jorge for details about his climb, for summit photos, for GPS data, Jorge does something that creates even more suspicion. He stays silent. He won't show the photos. He won't share the GPS data. He won't talk about the details of his climb. And this silence makes people start asking questions. Explorers Web and other media outlets start investigating Jorge's claim. They interview other climbers who were on the mountain that day. They analyze weather reports. They're finding inconsistencies. Finally, under mounting pressure, Jorge comes clean. He admits that he stopped 39 feet short of the summit because of dangerous snow conditions. Now you might think, okay, so we clarified what happened, problem solved. But it wasn't that simple. Jorge's silence had created doubt, not just about his K2 claim, but about his entire climbing resume. People started questioning whether he had really reached the summits of other mountains on his list. The website 8000ers.com, which keeps the most authoritative records of high-altitude climbing, removed Jorge's K2 summit from their database. They also concluded that he hadn't reached the true summits of 2 other mountains, Manaslu and Annapurna. Jorge Egoiaga, who had once been celebrated as one of the world's elite high-altitude climbers, suddenly found himself branded as a fraud, all because he decided to take the safe route. But here's where Jorge's story gets really interesting. Instead of disappearing in shame like most people would, Jorge decided to prove his critics wrong. Over the next several years, he quietly went back to every mountain he was accused of not summiting. He climbed Manaslu again. He climbed Annapurna again. And in 2023, at the age of 57, he returned to K2. This time, there was no controversy, no disputed photos, no questions about his route or timing. Jorge Egoiaga reached the genuine summit of K2, finally completing the climb that had eluded him 14 years earlier. These two guys weren't inexperienced weekend warriors making ridiculous claims. Christian Stangl and Jorge Egoiaga were both genuinely skilled, accomplished climbers who had spent decades building their reputations. So what drove them to risk everything? Well, there's more to the stories. Christian was a sponsored athlete whose entire career depended on completing his 7-second summits project. The pressure wasn't just personal, it was financial, professional, and public. When faced with the choice between admitting failure and constructing a lie, the lie seemed safer. Jorge's case is even more complicated because he actually made the right decision. He chose his life over 39 feet of dangerous terrain. But in a sport where only the summit counts, his wisdom was seen as a failure. The mountaineering community's obsession with absolute achievement, where 39 feet can be the difference between hero and failure, creates an environment where even experienced climbers feel pressured to lie. So the answer is pressure. Crushing, overwhelming pressure. K2 fraud is particularly cruel because, unlike Everest, where hundreds of people summit each year, K2 summits are rare and precious. There are fewer witnesses, less documentation, and more opportunity for lies to go undetected. But there are heroes in these stories too. The internet detectives who spent hours analyzing photos and exposing fake claims. The other climbers who refused to stay silent when they witnessed fraud. The websites and organizations that chose accuracy over sensationalism. Since these major fraud cases came to light, the mountaineering community has developed better verification processes. GPS tracking is now standard. Photo analysis has become more sophisticated. Summit claims are scrutinized more carefully. But perhaps most importantly, there's growing recognition that not every climb has to end at the summit to be successful. The stories aren't really about mountaineering fraud. They're about what happens when we create a system where only perfection is acceptable, where there's no room for human limitations or good judgment. K2 doesn't care about your sponsors, your reputation, or your career goals. It judges every climber with the same brutal indifference. The mountain kills people who push too hard just as easily as it kills people who don't push hard enough. In the end, both Stangl and Egoiaga learned the same lesson. The summit isn't worth your integrity, and sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is turn around. The mountain will always be there, but your life, your reputation, and your peace of mind won't. Some lies are written in stone, but on K2, they're written in ice and snow and wind. And ice melts, snow shifts, wind changes direction. The truth, like the summit itself, is patient. It can wait. On July 22nd, 2014, 3 Nepali women proudly stood on top of K2, celebrated as the first all-female team to conquer the world's deadliest mountain. They made history on a savage mountain, or did they? From wild controversy to questions on who really led the way. Today, we're looking at the K2 summit that sparked global outrage. In the summer of 2014, 3 Nepalese climbers, Pasang Lamu Sherpa, Dawa Yongsum Sherpa, and Maya Sherpa, set out to make history. Their goal was to become the first all-female team to summit K2, known more infamously as the Savage Mountain. From the onset, girl power was central to their expedition. These women originated from the quiet valleys where their voices have long been muted. For generations, Nepali women have carried the burdens of their homes and communities, their strength often unseen, their aspirations unheard. Yet, our 3 climbers believed the towering peaks of K2 could serve as more than just a backdrop. It could become a stage where they could showcase the capabilities of Nepali women, and by reaching the summit, they could shatter stereotypes and open the door for the next generation of female climbers. Their revolutionary expedition was organized by the Himalayan Women Welfare Society, alongside support from various organizations and government bodies. All three women were already accomplished climbers, with Pasang and Dawa being graduates of the renowned Khumbu Climbing Center. Maya, on the other hand, had earned the respect from the broader climbing community when she became the first Nepalese woman to summit Cho Oyu, the world's sixth highest mountain. She had also already scaled Everest twice by this point, and her impressive status earned her the position of team leader on the expedition. This would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the team. But the three female climbers were not just on a personal mission. They were determined to use their K2 climb as a way to inspire women in their country and around the world, and to encourage greater female participation in the sport. Their climb was particularly significant at the time, given the challenges faced by Nepali women in a male-dominated industry. And if that's not enough, there was also another side to their climb. All three women shared a strong passion for the environment, and this expedition would also stand as a platform to raise awareness about climate change. Their motto throughout the entire climb was "Women Climbing for Climate Change." As they readied themselves for the adventure of a lifetime, many considered the expedition a bold undertaking. For longtime followers of the channel, you know we speak of K2 with great respect, and for good reason. This mountain demands respect, and for those who underestimate it, they often pay the ultimate price. Within the mountaineering community, K2 is known as the Savage Mountain, a title it has earned due to its exceptionally high fatality rate and the dangerous climbing conditions it presents. For every 4 brave souls who attempt to conquer its towering summit, 1 will not return home. These are not good odds and are worse than Everest's. So when the female climbers bid farewell to their friends and families on May 21st at a ceremony in Kathmandu, they were aware of the dangers they would face. By early summer, they had arrived on the mountain, and over the next 7 weeks, they faced unpredictable and severe weather, including strong winds, frequent storms, and sub-zero temperatures. By the time they reached base camp at around 16,900 feet above sea level, they were likely already exhausted, but this was where the real challenge began. From here, they had to climb steep slopes, carefully navigate around avalanche-prone terrain, and use their technical skills to climb over sharp rock faces. It was no walk in the park, but their thorough preparation and training reassured them and their loved ones that they were as ready as they could be for the challenges ahead. But the final push almost became more than anyone had bargained for. After many weeks on the mountain, the female team was set to face their most formidable challenge yet. By mid-July, they were ready for the final push, which was a week spent climbing up a staggering 11,000 feet from K2's advanced base camp to the summit. Here, they moved between 4 camps, overcoming the notorious House Chimney, a particularly dangerous part of the climb. This is due to its steep, icy, and narrow nature, combined with the high altitude and potential for falling rocks and ice. Then came the summit push. The 3 women had to climb over 2,100 feet and navigate an infamous, dangerous, and unpredictable bottleneck. This is a narrow couloir located approximately 1,300 feet below the summit. At this height, the human body struggles to function. Oxygen levels are drastically reduced, and this can lead to confusion, impaired judgment, and even hallucinations. But this wasn't the only thing the Nepali team had to fight against. They must also deal with the massive serac that hovers above the bottleneck. Large chunks of this towering block of glacial ice could break off without warning, and if it did, the climbers would be thrown into immediate danger, as it would unleash an avalanche of ice and snow, sweeping away anyone in its path. Unfortunately, many climbers have lost their lives here due to serac falls. However, despite the challenges that lay before them, the Nepali women persevered with the climb, and by 3:35 p.m. on July 26, 2014, they finally reached the summit. By reaching the peak of K2 and planting the Nepalese flag on its snow-covered mountains, the 3 climbers claimed to be the first all-female team ever to summit K2. Looking back on this achievement, Pasang explained, "At the top, I was so emotional. We were all crying. I was too happy to talk." For the 3 women, this was more than a personal achievement. It was an accomplishment that sought to inspire the future generations of female climbers. It was a truly pivotal moment for women's mountaineering, showcasing the power of the female spirit in a predominantly male-dominated sport. The true nature of their achievement was highlighted by the small number of women who had climbed K2. At the time of the Nepali Female Summit, as few as 18 of the 376 people who reached the top of the Savage Mountain were women. Therefore, 3 female climbers reaching the summit during one expedition was a monumental achievement. However, even the most significant triumphs come with criticism in one form or another, and despite what they had just overcome, their accomplishment was soon called into question online. As we all know, the internet can quickly turn against us, and these female climbers were about to find out just how cruel and unforgiving it can be. The details of their climb and the subsequent claims of an all-female summit quickly became a source of contention. Had they really reached the top of K2 by themselves? And if not, who really helped these 3 Nepalese women reach the summit of the world's most infamous mountain? Some critics began to question the authenticity of their claim, and it soon became apparent that the 3 women had relied on male porters and Sherpas for most of the climb. This led the critics to begin pushing a different narrative, and the central question became, did the Nepali team's success truly represent an all-female achievement, or did the contributions of the male Sherpas who played crucial roles in setting up camps, fixing ropes, and guiding the climbers diminish the claim? For any new viewers to the channel, the role Sherpas play in reaching many of the world's highest peaks cannot be overstated. In fact, many climbers would argue they are essential. They're renowned for their expertise in high-altitude climbing, their ability to carry heavy loads, and their knowledge of the mountain. They're often the unsung heroes of expeditions, playing a vital role in ensuring the safety and success of climbers. In the case of the K2 expedition, male Sherpas were responsible for tasks such as fixing ropes, setting up camps, and carrying essential equipment. Without their support, the summit attempt would have been significantly more difficult, if not impossible. Maya's husband, Arnold Koester, who works as a mountain guide, was quick to come to the defense of the women. He claimed the women operated independently during their climb, explaining they made their own decisions, carried their own gear, but when it was summit time, the whole group had to work together. But when people online heard that the Nepali women had pushed for the summit alongside another team, they were again quick to criticize the expedition's all-female label. However, going for the summit alongside another team is not uncommon. Generally, the weather and terrain dictate when and where teams move, so it's to be expected that separate expedition groups blend together during the final leg of a climb. But regardless of these points made by various members of the climbing community, the controversy surrounding the K2 summit continued to escalate. Accusations of exaggeration and misrepresentation were directed towards the Sherpa women and their supporters. Some climbers and mountaineering experts expressed skepticism about the team's account of the climb, and the debate spilled over into social media and mountaineering forums, with passionate arguments on both sides. Critics argued the summit was a team effort, and the Sherpas' contributions should have been acknowledged more prominently. Some even felt that the all-female narrative was used to garner attention and recognition, while the Sherpas, who played a critical role, were not given adequate credit. But supporters of the Nepali women passionately defended their achievement, emphasizing the immense challenges they faced and the unwavering courage and determination they displayed. They argued that the criticism was fueled by sexism and a lack of respect for Nepali mountaineers. Even today in Nepal, women still face challenges in having their voices heard and ensuring their rights are fully realized, despite legal and constitutional protections. While progress has been made in areas like political representation, significant barriers remain, particularly in rural areas and for marginalized groups. Some feminist groups would go as far as to argue that Nepali women still have no voice in either the political or social spheres. So was this a matter of gender? If it were a male team with female porters, would the internet have reacted the same? As we previously mentioned, there's more than one way to view the controversial claims, and it could be said that neither side of the argument is entirely accurate. When it comes to attributing credit for the climb, many have argued it should have nothing to do with gender. Instead, everyone who took part in the expedition should be credited for the role they played, including both male and female porters. as many believe such expeditions could not go ahead without them. This then leads us to consider the ethical side of the dilemma. As the vast majority of the summits are completed with the aid of porters, should critics openly question the support system behind a climb or simply celebrate the achievement? When we think of all of the greatest mountaineering achievements of the past few decades, more often than not, it is those who either set foot on the summit or skied down from its towering slopes that received all of the credit. But just like the Nepalese female team, they also had porters carrying their gear and setting up lines. Did it ever diminish their achievements? Most would argue no. This is the position taken by Hillary O'Neill, a professional ski mountaineer who successfully summited Everest with Dawa in 2012. When asked about the controversy of many porters aiding in the alleged all-female summit, Hillary said, "I don't think their accomplishment is diminished, it's just different. It's still an amazing accomplishment because they have a lot of social constraints that they are overcoming, regardless if men were on it." But this isn't the first time in history a controversy has arisen in the wake of a female team's success. Back in 1978, the American climber Arlene Bloom led an all-female team to the top of Annapurna. In a similar manner to the Nepali K2 expedition, their accomplishment came under scrutiny, as they also had male porters assisting them in carrying supplies up the mountain. When questioned about this, Arlene said, 2 years earlier in 1976, the American bicentennial Everest expedition was supported by 40 Sherpas. Does that diminish the climb being an American one? Arlene's quote leads us to consider the idea that when American expeditions reach the top of summits in Asia, they generally don't share the credit. For example, if a team from California summits K2 using a team of Pakistani porters and Sherpas, they don't call it a successful American-Pakistani summit. But should they? Should it then not be the same for every summit? If an American team that only made it to the summit due to the back-breaking work of Pakistani or Nepali porters and Sherpas can call it an American expedition, shouldn't the Nepali women be allowed to do the same thing? Why did they receive so much backlash for simply highlighting that the main expedition was an all-female team? This brings us to one important point, that many in the wider mountaineering world believe climbers often take too much credit, even if unintentionally. This is best portrayed in the story of the first climbers to reach the summit of Mount Everest. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay made history by reaching the top of the world's highest mountain. Tenzing, who also worked as a Sherpa during this iconic climb, was an experienced mountaineer and played a crucial role in the expedition's success. Despite Edmund frequently calling Tenzing his partner, some argue the Sherpa's contributions were not fully recognized, and that the focus on Hillary overshadowed Tenzing's achievements. This has led to discussions about the historical context of the expedition, including the colonial dynamics and the potential for underrepresentation of Sherpa contributions. On the one hand, we've seen how Sherpas and porters are often overlooked, despite their crucial role in helping climbers reach the summit of the world's highest mountains. However, on the other hand, their contribution shouldn't overshadow the accomplishments of climbers, such as the Nepali women who remarkably reached the summit of the world's most treacherous mountain. But what do you think? Is there a way we can find a middle ground where both sides are equally represented? Or do you believe one side has more of a claim to fame? Here's one more thing to consider. When the Nepalis made their daring adventure up the Savage Mountain in 2014, even if they had wanted an all-female team, meaning no male porters or support staff of any kind, it would have been all but impossible. As O'Neill pointed out, the entire structure of Himalaya expeditions is 99.9% male-dominated, from the porters to the cooks to the waiters who serve and clean. There simply weren't enough female porters or support staff in the mountaineering community. They just accomplished something extraordinary. By conquering one of the world's highest peaks, these women not only achieved a personal milestone, but also sent a clear message about the capabilities of women as a whole and the right to pursue their passions, regardless of societal limitations. Pasang, like other climbers, was forced to deal with sexist remarks from an early age, but she used this as fuel to overcome the stereotypes associated with mountaineering. When she was just 15, Pasang was frequently reminded that climbing mountains as a profession was a man's job, and people continuously discouraged her, claiming that earning money and supporting a family was a man's role. But considering she lost her father at a young age, and then her mother, she had no option but to break the mold and earn a living by doing what she loved. In the end, this allowed her to also care for her younger sister. Climbing mountains was never about fame or adventure for Pasong. The mountains were something she felt a deep connection to. Speaking in one interview, she said, "I've always loved mountains. They're extremely fair. They don't differentiate whether you were a man or a woman." Despite the clear passion Pasong and her female counterparts Maya and Dawa had for the mountains, the controversy surrounding their expedition received criticism from all angles. But they never set out to offend anyone. All they aimed to demonstrate was that a team led by female climbers could, in fact, summit the world's most treacherous mountain, and they did it. Did it really matter that they called the expedition the first all-female summit? The controversy surrounding the label leads us back to the heart of the debate. What really defines an all-female climb? Does it mean that only women reached the summit? Or does it encompass the entire team, including support staff? The expedition's organizers and the climbers themselves had to clarify their position on this matter. Some argued that the focus should be on the women who reached the summit, while others believed that the contributions of the entire team should be acknowledged. But what do you think? What's your take on this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. After facing considerable online hate and dismissals of her team's achievement, Pasong decided to set the record straight. Speaking in an interview, she said, "Everyone who climbs big mountains relies on a team of porters or Sherpas. We just did what's normal in mountaineering. We would like people to recognize us as the first women's team to summit K2, rather than the first all-women's team." It's unlikely the debate will be resolved anytime soon, but according to Conrad Anker, who has summited Everest an impressive 3 times, regardless of this one contentious summit, women will continue to drive the sport forward. Speaking on what's next for female mountaineers, he said, "Probably the next thing for women alpine climbers is to go out and do demanding new routes. Repeating the standard route is great, but a new route on K2, and there are plenty of opportunities, by a woman would be a total breakthrough, regardless of gender. That would be a remarkable thing." His point highlights the fact that women are just as capable of making breakthroughs in mountaineering, and, given the opportunity, they can achieve anything a male climber can. As for the 3 Nepali women, their monumental achievement back in 2014 certainly helped motivate the next generation of female climbers. However, we're also compelled to acknowledge that the controversy surrounding the all-female summit of K2 has had a lasting impact on the mountaineering world. It highlighted the challenges faced by female mountaineers in a traditionally male-dominated field, as well as the importance of accurate reporting and transparency in the mountaineering community. The debate also raised questions about the ethics of commercial expeditions and the role of support teams in achieving summit success. While the controversy may have overshadowed the bravery of the Sherpa women, their attempt to summit K2 remains a significant event in mountaineering history. It serves as a reminder of the human spirit's capacity for adventure and the complexities of interpreting and celebrating such achievements. July 27th, 2023. A young porter lay dying near the summit of K2's brutal mountain. He had no gloves, no proper suit, no oxygen, and he wasn't even listed on the official permit. As Mohammed Hassan collapsed at the bottleneck, one of the deadliest choke points on Earth, climbers stepped over him, chasing their summit dreams, while he slowly froze to death. His death wasn't just tragic, it was a haunting black mark in the history of climbing. A moment that forced the mountaineering world to ask what it had become. But in 2025, everything is different. The rules, the gear, the ethics, and the way the world watches every step. From paragliders launching off the summit, to government crackdowns, to climate chaos, climbing K2 won't be the same after 2025. One mountain stands above almost all others, whispered with a mix of awe and dread. K2. It is the world's second highest peak, rising to a height of 28,251 feet above sea level in the Karakoram Range on the China-Pakistan border. Yet, its reputation for brutality often overshadows its slightly taller sibling, Everest. Known in the climbing world as the Savage Mountain, K2 presents an unparalleled challenge. where human ambition clashes with nature's raw, unforgiving power. K2's slopes are notorious for their technical difficulty, including extremely dangerous sections like the Black Pyramid and the infamous bottleneck, which demand extreme skill and resilience from climbers. But the most terrifying part is that K2 has a startling fatality rate, with climbers dying during their descent. As many as 37% of people die on the mountain on the way down, which is significantly higher than the 27% on Everest. But what compels individuals to take on such a formidable mountain, risking life and limb on its treacherous slopes? For some, it is the ultimate personal test, a quest to push the boundaries of human endurance against a peak often considered the holy grail of climbing. For others, like the indigenous peoples of the mountains, it embodies a profound sense of national pride, a mission to hoist their flag atop a summit that represents the pinnacle of mountaineering achievement. Whatever the motivation behind undertaking such a daring adventure, this infamous mountain draws climbers from around the world year after year. In 2024, it's estimated that as many as 175 permits were issued for K2. The media reported that between 50 and 65 people managed to reach the summit. However, the exact number of both permits and summits is uncertain, as, unlike Nepal's Ministry of Tourism, the Pakistan government does not issue reports. For the most part, expeditions to the summit of this mountain follow a general pattern. If you want to become one of the few climbers to reach the towering peaks of K2, to start, you'll need to pay several $1,000s for their permit. Once that's done, and you buy all the personal gear you need, it's time to pack your bags and head to the airport. From there, you'll fly into Skardu, Pakistan, which serves as the gateway to the breathtaking Karakoram mountain range. Then, after a relatively long and bumpy bus ride to Askol, you'll begin a challenging week-long trek to base camp. Already exhausted from the journey, this is where the real fun and danger begins. You'll spend weeks carrying supplies to higher camps and fixing ropes to aid in the final ascent, acclimating yourself in the process. You'll face blistering winds, heavy snowfall, and the risk of disappearing down a crevasse, never to be seen again. But if you play your cards right, after weeks of agonizing climbing and plummeting temperatures, the skies will open and you'll make your way to the top of the second tallest summit in the world. For many, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and worth the risk. However, not everyone reaches the summit of this mountain and lives to tell the tale. For many, it was the last peak they ever climbed. On July 27, 2023, 27-year-old Pakistani porter Mohammed Hassan was part of a team on K2, hired by the popular tour operator Leela Peak Expeditions. One of Mohammed's jobs involved installing ropes as fixed safety lines for the climbers on the expedition. But this is no easy task. Each fixing had to be carefully set into place. All the while, he battled against the plummeting temperatures, heavy winds, and dangerous terrain, which, at any minute, could leave him falling down the mountain. But this wasn't the only danger he faced. You see, this was Mohammed's first time working on an 8,000er, which is a mountaineering term that means a peak higher than 8,000 meters. Despite spending considerable time as a low-altitude porter on K2 and Spontic, this expedition was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Everything was far more intense, from the climbing to the unpredictable weather, and soon, he would face the brutality of the mountain head-on. On the night of July 27th, Mohammed was carrying ropes for the Sherpa team. At around 26,900 feet above sea level, he slipped and fell over 20 feet down a steep snow slope, becoming entangled in the fixed ropes. He yelled out in agony as the whip of the ropes snapped his legs. He began crying for help as he dangled uncontrollably upside down, swaying from side to side. It's difficult to imagine the level of fear that would come over someone in such a terrifying situation. With each passing moment, the risk of hypothermia increased, and the young porter's life was now in danger. Sherpas quickly rushed to his aid and tried to pull him back up, but even with several people pulling on the rope, it was not possible. Then, the unimaginable happened. Allegedly, the Sherpas gave up and turned their back on Mohammed, leaving him dangling upside down in unimaginable pain as they continued with their rope-fixing work. But the worst part, no help was coming. Several other expeditions were on the mountain that day and were forced to step over Muhammad's now severely weakened body. His terrifying cries soon turned to faint mumbles, and before long, he fell silent. As climbers continued to push for the summit, many were forced to look on as Muhammad dangled over the edge of the infamous bottleneck. One of them was Kristin Harila, a Norwegian northern Sami mountaineer and former cross-country skier. She was part of a large expedition on this fateful day. Her recollection of the story would later send chills down the spine of listeners as she described the events that occurred. As her team pushed for the summit, they saw Muhammad dangling 16 feet down the bottleneck upside down. He was without a down suit, had no oxygen, and his stomach was bare. He was exposed to the plummeting temperatures and blistering winds. Kristin claims that when they saw the severity of the situation, they tried their best to help the porter, even going as far as to risk their own lives. One Sherpa with her team clipped their rope to the team and slowly lowered themselves down to Muhammad in an attempt to turn him around. At this point, it was clear the porter's legs were broken. He was unresponsive, and he was freezing to death. Kristin and her team desperately tried to help the porter, and eventually, after over an hour, they managed to turn Muhammad and supply him with oxygen and warm water. If they were going to attempt to save his life, they needed to act quickly, but time was against them, and moments later, a series of unfortunate events would force Kristin's team to split up. News of an avalanche and a problem with the fixing team led Kristin and the Sherpas to continue along the trail, while their cameraman, Gabriel Tarso, remained behind with Muhammad for hours, sharing his oxygen and risking his own life. Eventually, he managed to make a pulling system with 3 anchors and a rope. He and Muhammad's friend used what energy they had left to pull him up little by little, eventually bringing him to rest on a small ice shelf. They fed him warm water and tried anything they could to warm his numb body, but supplying Muhammad with oxygen quickly drained his own reserves, and he was forced to leave and join the others on their push to the summit. Here, another climber gave Gabriel another bottle of oxygen, but by the time they all returned to the bottleneck, it was too late, and Muhammad had sadly passed. From the moment they laid eyes on Muhammad, however, the team knew deep down there was nothing they could have done. As his legs were broken, he needed to be carried. But Kristin pointed out in an interview, you need 4 to 6 people to carry a person down, especially in dangerous areas. However, the bottleneck is so narrow that you can only fit 1 person in front and 1 behind the person being helped. In this case, it was impossible to safely carry Hassan down without risking more lives. Others who witnessed the event strongly criticized the lack of a rescue mission. They suggested that if a Westerner had been in Muhammad's place, a more vigorous rescue operation would have been launched. But how? All of this was climbers helping each other. They had no authority to rely on, no chances to call for rescue missions. The treacherous location of the incident made it all but impossible for a rescue team or helicopter to reach Muhammad, leaving them with no option but to leave him to die. But what do you think? Considering the danger of the tight bottleneck, would you leave someone to die alone on the mountain? Or would you remain behind and try to organize some form of rescue? After a thorough investigation by the Gilgit-Baltistan government, the regulatory body responsible for overseeing mountaineering activities in the region, into the porter's death, they concluded that Lila Peak expeditions had violated multiple regulations, including not providing proper gear to Hassan, hiring an inexperienced high-altitude porter, and lacking required insurance. In simple terms, they were, in part, responsible for the young porter's death. He was employed to climb one of the world's highest and most dangerous mountains without proper gear, such as a down suit, gloves, and supplemental oxygen. Yet, despite the total lack of care for Muhammad's life, the tour group was slapped with a 2-year ban from operating on K2. Many deem this too light a punishment. Muhammad's tragic death has spurred a series of recommendations aimed at improving the safety of porters. These changes, along with other upcoming regulations, are set to transform the K2 experience, leading many in the climbing community to propose that after 2025, things will never be the same on the mountain. In the wake of the porter's death, it highlighted just how dangerous the job can be. You see, the life of a porter is not easy. They carry heavy loads of supplies up and down the mountain, set up ropes along dangerous trails, and undoubtedly risk their lives each and every day they go to work. While some climbers might face the bottleneck of K2 3 or 4 times, a porter like Muhammad can do this dozens of times in a single season. Unfortunately, many in the climbing community agree that they're unfairly compensated for their dangerous work. High-altitude porters on K2 expeditions, especially those working in Pakistan, are often paid significantly less than Sherpas in Nepal, despite the challenging conditions and high altitudes. A 3-week rate for a low-altitude porter on K2 might be as low as $55, with no consistent rate for high-altitude porters. While some companies supplement these wages or collect additional tips from clients, many consider the standard rates too low. Could you imagine risking your life carrying backbreaking loads up some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth for as little as a few coffees and pastries from Starbucks? But for many porters, this is their everyday reality. Muhammad's death has had a rippling effect on some of the changes climbers will soon witness on K2. It not only highlighted the necessity for better care for porters, but also just how dangerous their jobs are. The Pakistani government's report on the incident highlighted several issues, including the lack of proper gear, training, and insurance for high-altitude porters, or HAPs. This led to the establishment of new laws that included mandatory insurance coverage for people like Muhammad. But not only will HAPs be covered, reports suggest insurance must be provided for guides, cooks, kitchen boys, and low-altitude porters, per the new government laws. For many seeking to climb K2, the cost of this insurance is included in the overall package price for the expeditions through groups such as Makalu Extreme Treks and Expeditions. This is a major turning point for porters and will ensure they receive the proper financial protection for not only themselves, but also their families should something happen to them while they're on the mountain. The risk of injury or death is significant, and medical evacuation can be extremely costly. For instance, a helicopter evacuation in Pakistan can cost as much as $25,000. So by receiving insurance, porters gain access not only to financial protection in case they're seriously injured or worse, but also to emergency medical evacuation services. But that's not all the authorities are doing to ensure climber safety. In a crackdown on regulations, officials have announced that any tourist group that fails to follow the rules, such as not providing insurance or proper gear to their support staff, could face severe penalties. These could range from hefty fines to suspension of climbing permits. This strict enforcement could be in response to the backlash received in the wake of Muhammad's unfortunate death. As we mentioned previously in the video, the Gilgit-Baltistan government issued Lila Peak expeditions with a 2-year ban for not providing Muhammad with adequate equipment, which ultimately played a role in his death. This was a major blow for the Skardu-based company run by brothers Anwar and Akbar Syed, as all of Pakistan's 8,000ers lie within Gilgit-Baltistan. But more so, it served as a chilling warning to any other outfitter who is currently not taking the welfare of their employees into account. These are just 2 of several more changes coming to K2 in the coming years. But none will affect tourism and climbers themselves, quite like the new prices set to hit the mountain this year. Like many of the world's most sought-after summits, K2 is under the jurisdiction of a government. The Gilgit-Baltistan government of Pakistan grants permits for climbing K2 from the southern side. Meanwhile, the Chinese government, through its authorities in Xinjiang, grants permits for the northern side of K2. The most popular route up the mountain is the Abruzzi Ridge, located on the southern face of the mountain, on the Pakistani side. This is where the majority of K2 climbs originate and where most seek to obtain a permit. In 2025, the Gilgit-Baltistan government left the climbing community shocked after announcing a significant increase in permit fees. In years prior, climbers could apply for a group permit that covered up to 7 climbers for around $12,000. Each additional climber in the expedition would cost another $3,000. But much to the disappointment of climbers, this is all set to change, and they will have to pay considerably more to reach the summit of this infamous mountain. The Gilgit-Baltistan authorities have gotten rid of the collective fee and established an individual royalty of $5,000 per climber. A group of 7 climbers that paid $12,000 this year will, therefore, pay $35,000 in 2025. That's nearly a 200% increase. The news didn't sit well with guides whose livelihood depends on tourism. According to Ali Porikh of Jasmine Tours, this is not good for promoting adventure tourism in Pakistan. Mingma G. Sherpa, owner of Imagine Nepal, also expressed his concerns on social media, stating that this year the number of climbers in Pakistan dropped, and it will definitely be less next year if the new prices are confirmed. He further added, "We have our reservations for next year, but it could be our last season in Pakistan." Just like that, the Pakistani government could single-handedly reduce the number of climbers coming to the country each year due to the drastic increase in permit prices. It all came to a head this year when many of the local tourist outfitters took the case before the chief court of Gilgit-Baltistan. But when the tribunal placed the price increase on hold, the Pakistani government decided it would delay issuing any new permits. At this point, the disagreement between the officials and outfitters had turned into an old-fashioned standoff. It has since turned into a nightmare for tourists on the ground who had prematurely flown to Pakistan in hopes of obtaining a permit. On March 26th, Dawn reported that, quote, over 200 foreign trekkers and mountaineers through their tour operators have already applied for trekking and mountaineering in Gilgit-Baltistan, but the tourism department has not issued permits. Essentially, tourists became stranded as the tour companies lacked the permits required for trekking and climbing mountains like K2. In the end, many were forced to return back home without ever seeing any of the breathtaking views they were promised. Could you imagine spending thousands of dollars on flights, accommodations, and flying thousands of miles across the world, only to be told you can't climb K2 because the government won't issue a permit? The ongoing war between tour operators and Pakistani officials is taking its toll on those wishing to climb K2, and many have opted to venture elsewhere. However, there's a glimmer of hope. Unofficial estimates suggest prices may drop to around $3,000 per person. But you might be asking, why would a government that was already charging at least $12,000 per expedition want to increase this price further? Officials claim the increase aims to offset costs related to environmental degradation, waste management, and potentially reflect the true cost of climbing this challenging mountain. A key factor was the introduction of a waste management fee in 2023, specifically targeting the environmental impact of climbing expeditions. So, while these are credible reasons, the question remains, did the price need to increase by nearly 200% to cover these costs? Many climbers and outfitters argue no, but the drastic price increase is just the beginning of the changes. Perhaps the most unique thing we climbers are set to experience in the coming years is high-speed internet on the mountain. Yes, you heard that right. There's a chance that climbers at not only base camp but also high-altitude locations might be able to share a live feed of their expedition. And it's all thanks to Elon Musk's popular satellite internet provider, Starlink. For years, the Pakistani government had restrictions on Starlink, preventing its use in the country. However, in March 2025, an agreement was reached, opening up the possibility of high-speed internet even in the most remote parts of the nation. This includes areas like K2, where climbers can access high-speed internet tens of thousands of feet above sea level. If the expedition team brings along one of the relatively light satellites and a power source. Several K2 expeditions have already tried to use Starlink technology for communication, including those organized by mountain professionals and Imagine Nepal back in 2023. They had hoped this would allow teams to stay in touch with base camp and receive real-time weather updates, crucial for safety and planning during climbs. But unfortunately, at this time, the Pakistani government had disabled the use of Starlink in the country, and the trial ultimately failed. But with the 2025 deal, there's hope that the use of satellite internet on top of K2 could potentially revolutionize the climbing world, opening up new possibilities and enhancing the overall experience. Hopefully, that helps climbers check the avalanche forecast and have a safer experience on K2. K2 is widely regarded as one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, and every year, dozens of people find themselves in life-threatening situations. But with Starlink, which utilizes an internet router that can be set up anywhere, it offers climbers the ability to send distress signals or call for help via satellite communication. However, others are looking at it as a way to promote the sport. Climbers will be able to share their experiences live through social media or blogs while on the mountain. We may enter into a new era of climbing where we receive daily vlogs from climbers as they make their way up the challenging and unpredictable terrain of K2, offering raw footage of the full expedition in real time. The options are limitless, and the availability of Starlink on K2 represents a transformative step forward for high-altitude climbing expeditions, enhancing safety, communication, and overall expedition management. If you're surprised by the use of Starlink on K2, wait till you hear about the next major change that's set to arrive in the coming years. This might totally revolutionize how climbers make their way down the mountain. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you're familiar with the dangers of the descent, the exhaustion from the climb, the mental and physical strain of walking downhill, the treacherous terrain, and the constant threat of falls, all combine to create a perilous situation. But what if there was a way to avoid all of this? What if climbers could simply soar off the mountain? Well, this is close to becoming a reality, but maybe not in the way you think. Paragliding from the summit of K2 has become a highly debated topic among climbers and adventure seekers. Back in 2024, Jean-Yves Frederickson, also known as Blutch, successfully reached the summit of the mountain and then launched himself from the peak to the ground below using a paraglider. The flight down must have been like something from a movie. As Jean slowly descended back to Earth, his line of sight would have been filled with breathtaking 360-degree views of the surrounding Karakoram Range, including snow-capped mountains, glaciers, and a panoramic view of the rugged landscape wedged between China and Pakistan. Jean held a special place in his heart for his paraglider, which he often refers to as his rope and backup. In one interview, he said, "With it on my back, I am sure that if anything happens, I can always escape and fly back down." Jean was one of 4 French climbers who summited K2 on July 28, 2024, without using oxygen. But they made headlines for another reason. Jean, alongside Benjamin Vedrine, Liv Sansos, and Zeb Roche, made history by being the first people to paraglide from the top of the mountain successfully. But their impressive achievement once again raised the question in the mountaineering world: could it be employed in times of need? The most obvious advantage of paragliding from the summit is its potential to serve as a life-saving measure in emergencies. Climbing K2 is a dangerous undertaking, with the constant threat of accidents or injuries. In such dangerous situations, paragliding could be the difference between life and death. For example, if a climber is injured or suffering from severe altitude sickness, paragliding offers a swift means of evacuation. This is particularly crucial on K2, where the rugged terrain and harsh weather conditions can make rescue operations extremely challenging. Moreover, paragliding from the summit can also reduce the risk of exhaustion and fatigue-related accidents during the descent. Climbing K2 is an extremely physically demanding task, and, as we previously mentioned, the descent can be just as challenging. By paragliding from the summit, climbers can conserve energy and reduce their exposure to potential hazards. However, paragliding from K2's summit is not without its own risks. The high altitude and unpredictable weather conditions make it a highly challenging and technical activity. Climbers must have extensive experience and training in both mountaineering and paragliding to attempt such a feat. Don't be surprised if we start to see more and more people paragliding from the summit of K2 as an alternative means of descent during emergencies. Changes like these are only natural as mountaineering continues to increase in popularity. More often than not, the climbing community plays a significant role in ushering in new regulations, but the authorities also play their part in ensuring the safety of not only tourists, but everyone who uses the mountain. What the future of K2 holds is uncertain. However, it's clear that things are set to change drastically in the years to come. From more expensive permits to live streams using Starlink and the potential to paraglide from this summer, I think it's safe to say that after 2025, climbing K2 could be an entirely new experience.
I am Frederick Ericson, a ski mountaineer from Sweden, living in Chamonix, France.
We're at the Alpine Club of Pakistan, and they're going to ask us a few questions to make sure that we are qualified to go up and achieve our objective.
Succeed in achieving your goal, that is to climb K2.
I agree with you.
It was August 6th, 2010, and Frederick Ericson had no idea it would be his last day on Earth. Imagine standing at 27,000 feet above sea level on K2, the world's second highest mountain. The air is so thin that your lungs burn with each breath. The temperature hovers around negative 40 degrees. Your brain is swelling from oxygen deprivation. Your blood is thickening to the consistency of ketchup, and you're staring down a near vertical ice corridor with a massive, unstable glacier hanging directly above your head. You click into a pair of ski bindings and point those skis downhill in that crazy, dangerous terrain, where a tiny mistake is the difference between life and death. Today, I'm covering one of the most ambitious and fatal mountain attempts in human history. The story of a man who tried to ski down a mountain so dangerous it kills 1 in every 4 people who simply try to climb it. The chain of fateful choices that led him to that moment, and the shocking outcome that nobody saw coming. What I discovered about Frederick's final decision will make you question everything you thought you knew about risk. There's an invisible line on every mountain on Earth. It sits at approximately 26,000 feet above sea level. Above this line, the human body begins to die. Literally die. Your cells start shutting down. Your cognitive functions diminish. Your digestive system stops working. Every minute spent above this death zone is a minute stolen from the edge of mortality. Most people, even experienced mountaineers, spend as little time as possible in the death zone. They climb through it quickly, reach their summit, and descend the way they came, by climbing carefully down. But Frederick Ericson wasn't like most people. Frederick Ericson was born on March 14, 1975, in Sundsvall, Sweden, and grew up in the northern city of Umeå, a landscape of forests and modest hills rather than true mountains. Like many Swedish children, he learned to ski at an early age, but unlike his peers, Frederick developed an almost supernatural relationship with gravity and snow. By his 20s, he had abandoned groomed slopes for virgin powder on the highest peaks he could find. When most skiers were content tackling slopes in the Alps or Rockies, Frederick set his sights exponentially higher. He dreamed of skiing where no human had ever skied before, from the summits of the world's 14 26,000-foot peaks, all of which pierce deep into the death zone. By 2010, he had already put skis on 4 Himalayan giants: Shishapangma in 2004, Gasherbrum 2 in 2005, a near success on Lila Peak earlier in 2005, where he turned back just 500 feet below the summit, and a partial descent of Dhaulagiri in 2007. Each run fed his ultimate ambition, to be the first person to ski from the summit of K2. But there's a saying among mountaineers: Everest is a walk, K2 is a climb. Not to downplay the dangers of Everest from the comfort of my home. K2 stands 28,251 feet tall, making it second only to Everest in height. But height isn't what makes K2 deadly. It's the mountain's perfect storm of dangers. Unlike most mountains that get progressively steeper toward the top, K2 is relentlessly steep from bottom to top. At 45 degrees, its slopes are sharper than most expert ski runs at resorts. While on a ski slope, these would be marked as extreme terrain. On K2, the slopes are covered with ice, rocks, and crevasses, with drops of thousands of feet awaiting any misstep. And then there are the unpredictable weather patterns that can trap climbers for days. To make things worse, its remote location in the Karakoram Range between Pakistan and China makes rescue virtually impossible. The history of summiting K2 is written in tragedy. The first American expedition in 1938 ended in retreat after multiple close calls. The first successful summit didn't come until 1954, and even then, only 2 of the 11 Italian expedition members reached the top. In 1986, in what became known as the Black Summer, 13 climbers died in a single season, and yet, through all these decades of triumph and tragedy, no one had successfully skied from the summit of K2. Many had dismissed the idea as suicidal, but Frederick Ericson wasn't like most people. To understand why Frederick chose to do this, place yourself in his mind for a moment. You've already accomplished what few humans ever will. You've stood atop mountains where the air is so thin that most people would lose consciousness within hours. You've pointed your ski tips down slopes where any fall means certain death, and you've survived without a scratch. With each success, your confidence grows. The impossible starts to seem possible. The line between audacious and reckless begins to blur. This is the mental state that experts in extreme sports psychology call the expert trap. When past successes create a dangerous sense of invulnerability. It's not arrogance exactly, but a recalibration of what feels dangerous. Risks that would terrify most people begin to feel manageable. In 2009, Frederick made his first attempt at K2 with Italian mountaineer Michel Fate. Picture these two arriving at base camp, pumped up, excited, living their dream. They're even writing about their adventure for Powder magazine, sharing their journey with the world. Frederick was so confident, he actually wrote something that'll send chills down your spine when you hear what happened next. He said, "The drive through the waterfall to get here was probably more scary than anything we'll face on K2. Scarier than anything they would face on K2. Those words would come back to haunt him in the worst possible way. At first, everything was going great. They made their way up to their first camp at nearly 20,000 feet, navigating the massive maze of ice towers and hidden cracks that could swallow a person whole. A week later, they pushed up to their second camp, climbing slopes so steep they had to fix ropes just to move safely. Even the weather was playing nice. K2 is infamous for its deadly storms, but the mountain was calm, almost as if it was luring them in. Then came the day that would change everything. When you climb mountains this high, you can't just go straight to the top. Your body would shut down from the lack of oxygen. You have to acclimatize, climb high, sleep low, teaching your body to survive with less oxygen. So the two climbers were doing exactly that, and they decided to test the snow conditions by skiing down from Camp 2 back to base camp. Now picture it if you can. Michel Fate, an elite climber with multiple 26,000-foot peaks under his belt, was skiing down a slope that was tilted at 50 degrees. That was steeper than almost anything you'd find at a ski resort. The surface beneath his skis was a mix of snow and ice. Then, in an instant, everything went wrong. Fate caught an edge of his ski. That is, the metal side of his ski blade snagged on the ice instead of gliding over it. On a normal ski slope, this would have just meant a tumble, maybe a bruised ego, and a sore body. He would have slid a bit, self-arrested, dusted himself off, and continued down. But on K2 slopes, it was a death sentence. Frederick could only watch in horror as his friend tumbled down the mountain face. Imagine seeing someone you cared about bouncing off rocks, picking up speed, completely helpless. Fate fell 3,000 feet. That was like falling from a 300-story building. His body finally came to rest on a small snow plateau far below. Frederick immediately started making his way down to his friend. It took him 20 minutes of insanely dangerous solo descent to reach Fate's body. When he got there, the reality was unbearable. Fate's skull had been crushed from hitting a rock. His friend and climbing partner was gone, just like that. But here's where this story takes a turn that'll really make you question the human mind. Despite the risks, Frederick stayed on that same deadly slope for hours. He used his ice axe to dig a makeshift grave, covering Fate's body with snow and rocks. The whole time he was doing this, he was exposed to the exact same dangers that had just claimed his friend's life. Now, for most people, if you watched your friend die attempting something you were both there for, you'd probably pack up. Most would take this as the universe screaming at them to go home, to abandon the dream, to choose life over ambition. Everyone at base camp assumed Frederick would leave. Who wouldn't? But there's something different about people like Frederick. Their brains literally work differently from ours. Scientists have done MRI scans on extreme athletes, and they found something fascinating. These people have reduced activity in the amygdala, which is the fear center of your brain. At the same time, they have increased activity in the parts that process rewards. When you and I see danger, they see a challenge. When you and I feel fear, they feel laser focused. After 2 days alone in his tent, mourning his friend, Frederick emerged and announced something that shocked everyone at base camp. He wasn't giving up. He was coming back next year to try again. This wasn't disrespectful to his friend's memory. In Frederick's mind, it was almost a tribute. The dream they shared wouldn't die on that mountain, even if Michelle had. As the summer of 2010 rolled around, Frederick was back at K2's base camp. This time around, Frederick had a new partner, Austrian mountaineer Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner. And Gerlinde wasn't just any climber. She was one of the strongest female high-altitude climbers in history, pursuing her own incredible dream, becoming the first woman to climb all 14 26,000-foot peaks without using supplemental oxygen. By 2010, she'd already knocked off 12 of these monsters. She only needed K2 and Broad Peak to complete her historic quest. Gerlinde was exactly who Frederick needed by his side. Technically skilled, mentally tough as nails, and completely committed to climbing without bottled oxygen. See, many high-altitude climbers use artificial oxygen to fight off the death zone's effects. Not these two. They believed in facing the mountain in its purest form, with no technological crutches. This purist approach cranked up the risk factor significantly, but it aligned perfectly with their shared mountaineering philosophy. If you're going to dance with the devil, you might as well look him in the eye. The 2010 climbing season had been nothing short of miserable. A stubborn weather pattern had been hammering the Karakoram Range, sending storm after storm rolling in and dumping feet of unstable snow across K2's upper slopes. Teams had been stuck at base camp for weeks, waiting for a break that never seemed to come. Several expeditions had already thrown in the towel, unwilling to play this waiting game any longer. By early August, the situation was getting desperate. The climbing window was rapidly closing, with monsoon season lurking just around the corner. Before those predictable daily storms arrived with the monsoon, there might be just one brief window of stable weather, perhaps as short as a single day. 24 hours to achieve what most people couldn't do in perfect conditions with unlimited time. By August 5th, Frederick, Gerlinde, an American climber named Trey Cook, along with 6 other mountaineers, had somehow pushed through all of this. They reached Camp 4 at 26,000 feet and just below the summit after days of battling through deep snow that sometimes swallowed them to their waists with each step. From their position, only about 2,200 vertical feet remained to the summit, but those would be the most dangerous 2,200 feet of their lives. The weather forecast was ambiguous at best. Some suggested conditions might improve overnight, though storm clouds were gathering. 6 other climbers at Camp 4 decided to wait another day, even if this meant they would never summit K2. And Frederick, Gerlinde, and Trey found themselves staring down one of those life-defining decisions. Wait for potentially better weather, or seize what might be their only opportunity. Now, I want you to put yourself in that tent at 26,000 feet for a minute. Your body is literally dying in the thin air. Each breath feels insufficient, like you're trying to suck oxygen through a coffee straw. You've invested years of training for this moment, tens of thousands of dollars, countless hours of suffering, and now you're here, so close to your goal you can almost taste it. The forecast gives you just a sliver of hope. Conditions might improve. 6 other climbers with the same information decided it was too risky. What would you do? Frederick decided to go for it. Despite conditions starting to deteriorate around 11 p.m., with winds picking up and visibility dropping, they committed to their summit push, and that single decision would seal his fate. At 1:30 a.m. on August 6th, while those other climbers remained zipped and safe in their tents, Frederick, Garlande, and Trey stepped out into a cold so bitter it felt alive. Their headlamps cut weak yellow cones through the darkness, barely illuminating the next few feet of terrain. The temperature was cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, and looming above them in the darkness was the most technical, most feared section of the entire mountain, the notorious bottleneck. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what the bottleneck is. It's a narrow gully of near-vertical ice, approximately 300 feet high, with slopes approaching 80 degrees in places. It's essentially a natural funnel on the mountain that forces climbers into a confined space where they're exposed to multiple hazards simultaneously. The gully itself is challenging enough. Technical ice climbing at 27,000 feet requires tremendous skill and stamina. Each swing of an ice axe, each kick of a crampon at these heights demands precious oxygen that the brain and heart desperately need. Some climbers report that a single section that might take 30 minutes to climb at lower elevations requires 2 hours or more in the death zone. But what makes the bottleneck truly terrifying is what hangs directly above it. A hanging glacier the size of several buildings that can break off without warning, sending tons of ice crashing down through the gully. This serac, estimated to weigh thousands of tons, is held in place by physics that are constantly changing as the glacier shifts, warms, and cracks. It's like climbing inside the barrel of a loaded gun. Just 2 years earlier, in the worst disaster in K2's history, an ice collapse from this same serac had killed 11 climbers in a single day. During the 2008 climbing season, a section of the serac had broken free while numerous teams were attempting to descend from the summit. The falling ice swept away the fixed ropes that climbers were using to rappel, leaving many stranded without a way down. Some fell to their deaths immediately. Others succumbed to exposure after being trapped on the mountain for days. Frederick, Garlande, and Trey knew this history well. Every climber on K2 knows the stories of the 2008 disaster, but they also knew that the most dangerous place to be near a serac is directly underneath it. And the only way to minimize that risk is to move through the bottleneck as quickly as possible. At 7 a.m., after 5.5 hours of climbing through these nightmarish conditions, Trey had seen enough. The combination of extreme cold, visibility so poor they could barely see each other, and complete exhaustion convinced him the risk simply wasn't worth taking. He made the difficult decision to turn back. Frederick and Garlande continued upward. This was Frederick's second critical decision, choosing to continue when one of his climbing partners turned back. In mountaineering, when someone in your team decides conditions are too dangerous, it's like a red flag shooting up. It's a warning sign that demands attention. Trey Cook wasn't some amateur. He was an experienced mountaineer. Frederick pressed on anyway. But the most fateful decision was yet to come. As they approached the bottleneck, Frederick faced a choice about how to protect himself on the most dangerous section of the climb. Standard practice would be to use a rope between climbers, providing a lifeline in case of a slip, but ropes slow you down. And in the death zone, speed sometimes equals safety. The less time spent at extreme altitude, the better your chances of survival. Frederick chose to climb unroped through the bottleneck. He would go first, with Garlande following behind. There's one more factor you should know about Frederick's situation. Unlike most climbers attempting K2, he wasn't just carrying climbing gear. He had ski equipment strapped to his back. Those extra pounds might not seem like much when you're standing on solid ground, but at 27,000 feet, where just taking a single step can leave you gasping, that added weight is like carrying a small child on your back. It affects everything: your balance, your endurance, your ability to react quickly if something goes wrong. Frederick moved ahead into the bottleneck, his crampons biting into what appeared to be stable snow. The visibility was poor, with clouds wrapping around them, occasionally allowing brief glimpses of the terrain ahead. He was attempting to place a piton, a metal spike you hammer into the ice to create an anchor point on a small outcrop to the right of the main gully. As he worked, standing in seemingly deep snow, the surface beneath him suddenly gave way. On slopes this sharp, what happens next is pure, cold, unforgiving physics. The snow had been concealing a layer of hard, slick ice. Without warning, Frederick's footing collapsed. There was no rope to catch him, no second chance. In an instant, he was sliding, then tumbling, picking up speed with every foot of elevation lost. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Garlanday's panicked voice broke through on the radio. Her words sent chills through base camp. Frederick had fallen. She could only watch helplessly as her climbing partner accelerated down the mountain, disappearing into the clouds below. I want you to try to imagine, just for a second, what that moment must have been like for her. The absolute horror of watching someone you know, someone you've trusted your life to, suddenly vanish before your eyes. 1 second they're there, the next, gone. And knowing with absolute certainty what that disappearance means on a mountain like K2. Garlanday immediately began descending, her movements frantic yet careful, searching desperately for any trace of Frederick. All she managed to find was a single ski that had torn away during his violent fall, now lying alone on the slope like some grim marker. As she picked her way down through worsening conditions, she ran into 2 other climbers who had started up from Camp 4, Derek Zalewski from Poland and Fabrizio Zangrilli from the United States. The 3 of them made their way back to the relative safety of Camp 4 together, their silence heavier than any words could be. While this was happening, a Russian climber named Yura Ermachek had made his way down toward Camp 3 and positioned himself to scan the vast exposed flank that fell away from the climbing route. Through momentary breaks in the clouds, he spotted something that confirmed their worst fears. There, approximately 1,300 feet above Camp 3, lay Frederick's body. Even to these hardened mountaineers who lived in a world where death was a constant companion, the situation was brutally clear. Recovery would be impossible. The entire face was a death trap of avalanche risk. Anyone attempting to reach Frederick would likely join him in eternity. The mountain wasn't finished taking lives. It was just waiting for its next victim. After tense radio consultations that bounced between camps and eventually reached all the way to Frederick's father, a heart-wrenching decision was made. Frederick would stay where he fell, forever becoming part of the mountain he had dreamed of conquering. His final resting place had a view onto his favorite mountains, as one climber later described it, a small mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. Here's the cruel, twisted irony of it all. Frederick fell while climbing, never getting the chance to use the very skis he had carried all the way up the mountain. Those skis had added weight and altered his balance. Those skis that represented the dream that had pulled him back to K2, even after he'd watched his previous partner die on these same slopes. That dream would remain unfulfilled, hanging in the thin air like a ghost. When we pull back and look at what really happened that day, several things stand out, like warning signs that only become clear when it's too late to heed them. But none of this means Frederick was reckless or foolish. Everyone who knew him described him as methodical, careful, and experienced. What happened to Frederick could have happened to any climber on K2 that day. At that altitude, in those conditions, the line between making it home to tell your story and becoming part of the mountain forever can be as thin as a single snowflake. In the years since Frederick's death, only one person has successfully accomplished what he set out to do. In 2018, Polish climber Andrzej Bargiel became the first person to ski from the summit of K2 all the way down. And in a way, Frederick's attempt, despite its tragic end, helped make this possible. Bargiel studied Frederick's route and approach, learning both from his innovations and his fatal mistakes. That's often how progress works in the world of extreme adventure. The pioneers who push the boundaries further than anyone before sometimes pay the ultimate price, but their attempts inspire others to follow, to learn from their mistakes, to succeed where they fell short. Frederick Ericson's story isn't just about a man who died on a mountain. It's about that invisible line that separates courage from catastrophe. It's about the human drive to push beyond what seems possible, to risk everything for a dream that most would consider insane. So what drives people like Frederick? What makes someone return to a mountain that already killed their friend? Is it obsession, passion, or something else entirely that most of us will never understand? Now, I don't know the answers, but I do know that somewhere on K2, Frederick Ericson remains forever part of the mountain he loved. And maybe that's exactly where he was meant to be. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.